really don't know what is it. I'm not hearing anything. What the fuck is this?
I saw a comment of yours and just threw a key later on.
So this is very well planned for this. Hey.
Yes.
Is it okay if we missed like pretty because everyone takes points? Is it okay if we just sent this at during the presentations or something?
Yeah, those maybe we can. Those we have now we could allow. Is that where is that your seat? Nice. Lorraine was over there. No, Lorraine was over there. No, the seat was there. Yeah. Oh, okay. No, he was over there. His seat was over there. He didn't want to sit there.
That seat was taken.
Oh.
So he was in the back.
No, he's a speaker.
You might have to have it around actually,
Sir?
I think it might be better if I don't have something.
Yeah. No, he's a speaker.
Yes, and that's Andrew McKeon, and I can put him somewhere else, but I was just going to put.
I think it's better if I
I would
Let him take the seat.
yeah, because it's vacant. It was for him. The blue and the green. No, this is your seat there, the blue one.
Blue one, okay,
Yeah,
I'll
yeah,
take
the blue one. Yeah. Mrs. Patsy Robertson, Chair of the Ramphal Institute, Ambassador Farouk Saban, Patron of the Ramphal Institute, Professor Nigel Harris, Chancellor of the University of Guyana, High Commissioners, professors and researchers, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. My job today is to call this brainstorming roundtable to order, but before asking the first speaker, the chair of the Ramphal Institute, to welcome you, I wish to invite you to stand for 1 minute in remembrance and in paying respect for those who were killed just a few hours ago in Nice in this awful atrocity. 1 minute, please. Thank you. It is my pleasure to call on Mrs. Patsy Robertson, the chair of the Institute, to address you and to welcome you. Mrs. Robertson.
First, I'd like to extend to you all a warm welcome to King's and to this special occasion organized by the Ramphal Institute. I would like to, we've mentioned Ambassador Farouk Saban, or one of our patrons. We have High Commissioners here in person and representing the High Commission, other High Commissions. We have Dr. Patrick Gomez, head of the ACP, who is going to be joining us by not Spike, you know what I mean, Skype. I'm prejudiced against Skype. We have Dr. Paula Katuka, Director, Trade Policy Division of the Commonwealth Secretariat. We have other Ramphal Institute trustees, we have professors and researchers, and other distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I should say most distinguished ladies and gentlemen, which includes our very good friend, Professor Nigel Harris, who's here with his wife. Special welcome to you, madam. As well as Mr. McHale Andrew, President of the Caribbean Association of Investment Promotion Agencies. And we're delighted, really delighted, that we've managed to gather you on this special occasion. Now, as I mentioned before, Skype is going to play a big role, and many of the people taking part are not physically here today, but they're joining us from Africa, the Caribbean, Europe, the UK itself, and elsewhere. And I want, if it works, to extend a warm welcome to them. Now, several months ago, the Ramphal Institute, which, as you know, is a specialized think tank on problems for developing countries. We also specialize in trying to get things on the agenda of governments. We do not believe that policy studies should just be studies which are filed away. We want them to get to the people who make policies, and I think that is our special characteristic. But what we appreciated and began to think about, the possibility that Brexit might happen, and that it would have far-reaching consequences for developing countries that trade with the UK under an EPA with the EU. Now, since this legal agreement governs and supports trade with the EU, these countries' export trade could be thrown into disarray by the UK pulling out, but nobody expected the UK to pull out. So here we are today, that since the referendum in June, it is really now urgent, and that's why we are starting. This is our first big event to begin to look at the impact on Commonwealth developing countries, as well as possibilities for UK trading arrangements for the post-Brexit era if these countries' trade is not to be further harmed. Now, as you know, 30 odd of the member states of the Commonwealth are small island developing countries, and they are the ones who are going to feel the brunt of the fallout of this, shall I say, historic decision. Now, we hope that this roundtable will identify the further research, outreach, and engagement that will help us inform and support policy. And I would urge you all to think in terms of what you believe we should be pursuing in further discussions and studies. That key thing, it is what will support and inform the policy decisions, the thinking about policy for these countries which are very vulnerable. On that basis, it is my pleasure to welcome you again and to ask His Excellency Dr. Patrick Gomes, Secretary General of the ACP, to address us, and he's going to do it by Skype. We've had a lot of support from the ACP and we're working very closely with them. Thank you.
Account what transpired with the referendum held in the United Kingdom on leaving the European Union. It has compelled us in the ACP to address a number of major issues related to the implications of the referendum. While the full implications of Brexit will not be known for some time, a systematic impact analysis and suggestions for courses of action by the ACP group as a whole, by regions, and the 79 individual member states for engagement at various levels will need to be done at the appropriate time. However, for today, I offer some preliminary observations. Firstly, on the procedures for Brexit, as is well known, the result of the referendum is only a first step in a complex process of formal withdrawal from the European Union. In the UK, a parliamentary motion will have to be debated. The EU's Lisbon Treaty requires that the member state desirous of withdrawing from the Union must trigger the relevant Article 50 and initiate negotiations for the conditions and provisions that will apply following the cessation as a member of the Union. That process can last up to 2 years. What does some of this mean for the ACP group? Our relationship with the UK lies in the fact that the latter is a member of the European Union, and as long as it remains a member, is therefore bound in our views by all ACP EU agreements, Cotonou Partnership Agreement, the EPAs, everything but arms. There are no bilateral agreements between the UK and ACP. Key questions for our member states therefore include whether or not they will be able to ensure that the UK adhere to these agreements after it leaves the European Union, at least until the expiry of the Cotonou in 2020. If not, how will the EU deal with this, especially with respect to the significant proportion the EU contributes to the EDF, which is made up of voluntary contributions from EU members. For the period 2014 to 2020, the UK's contribution to the EDF amounts to about 15% of the fund, or approximately 4.5 billion euros. Will the UK prefer to review its options after Brexit as far as development partners are concerned? For instance, its cooperation with the Commonwealth Secretariat, the African Union, regional organizations as such. How should the ACP Group strategize and position itself to respond to these uncertainties? Moreover, the close economic, cultural and political ties between some ACP countries and the UK warrant the ACP Group to seek to develop bilateral ties with the UK after Brexit. Why we say this? We must take account of the UK's political clout as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, a key member of NATO, the G7, G20 for instance. All this makes the UK a valued partner even outside of its membership in the European Union. The ACP Group will attempt to safeguard the interests of its member states accruing from the UK's membership of the EU, including market access, trade and investment, and development financing. In the case of development finance cooperation under the Cotonou Agreement and the EDF, the UK contributes about 15%. It has also met its 0.7% of the GNI target for ODA and has bilateral programs as, for example, Trade Out of Poverty for Sub-Saharan Africa. Contributions to Aid for Trade by the UK have also been substantial. The ACP case will address how these contributions on development finance can be secured. Regarding trade, deep analysis is needed on the issue of the ACP-EU Economic Partnership Agreements. And also we must look at, in the event of exit, what will be the UK's response to honour its EPAs obligations to which it has attached its signature? Or will the UK launch a process of negotiations for bilateral trade agreements with the countries which make up the ACP? These agreements can have far-reaching effects. There is, for instance, the question whether the UK government will continue to recognize the EU's sanitary and phytosanitary standards and food safety approvals for imports of importance in the negotiations of an ACP-EU post-Cotonou agreement. In conclusion, therefore, relevant data needs to be collected and analyzed in areas of trade, investment and services between the UK and ACP countries. Our Department of Sustainable Economic Development and Trade, with assistance receiving from UNCTAD and also from the Ramphal Institute, will pursue this line of investigation. Similarly, the ACP Secretariat will incorporate the issue of Brexit into its discussions and analysis on the follow-up agreement, the Cotonou Partnership Agreement with the European Union, which ends in 2020. Meanwhile, we will think that our regions can monitor how their regional organizations are reacting, what is planned by individual governments, and how we can collaborate. These preliminary observations are offered to stimulate discussions, but we hope to find a cohesive and coherent strategy as we go forward to minimize the losses and enhance possibly new areas for cooperation. I thank you.
I thank the Secretary General of the ACP and now call on Ambassador Farooq Subhan, who is president of the Bangladesh Enterprise Institute. Ambassador Subhan is a former Foreign Secretary of Bangladesh and a long-standing friend of the Commonwealth, and most importantly for us, a patron of the Ramphal Institute. Ambassador Subhan.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, let me begin by saying how delighted I am to be here this afternoon and to share some thoughts with you. At the outset, I'd like to congratulate my colleagues at the Ramphal Institute, our chair, Patsy, and our founder trustee, Richard Bourne, and the director of the Institute, Edwin Laurent, for organizing this, I think, very timely event. I'll be extremely brief. I'd in fact like to echo much of what was just stated by Dr. Patrick Gomez, but let me just add 3 or 4 points. I think the first and to me very interesting point about Brexit is what does this mean in terms of Britain's foreign policy, in particular its economic assistance program. Britain, as we all should remember, did play a very important role in terms of promoting the interest of Commonwealth member states within the EU. And I think the ACP is certainly one very important example, and indeed Everything But Arms, which provided duty-free access to a large number of countries, including my own, Bangladesh, to the European market. So the first question is, can we hope, can we indeed expect the Britain now to divert some of that interest into the Commonwealth, in particular in supporting the work and the programs of the Commonwealth Secretariat and perhaps of institutions such as the Ramphal Institute, which is keen to support the work, the enormous research work that I think will be required in the post-Brexit period. I think the second point which I'd like to make is, and there was a reference to this by Dr. Patrick Gomez, was the very significant role that Britain plays today in supporting developing countries. Indeed, I would venture to say that Britain is perhaps, in terms of its total economic assistance, one of the largest donor countries in the world today. A substantial part of its economic assistance, however, was being invested through the EU. This money will now have to be reallocated and made available to countries bilaterally and perhaps through regional organizations, including organizations such as CARICOM and several others. A second, I think, point which I'd like to make from the perspective of my own country, Bangladesh. We export 300 million pounds worth of goods to the United Kingdom. A substantial part of that is made up of ready-made garments or apparel. Indeed, some of you may be interested to know that 1 out of every 3 shirts produced in the world today is produced, in fact, in Bangladesh. Marks and Spencer's is a major manufacturer out of Bangladesh. So naturally, we have concerns because all our goods come to the UK duty-free. We hope that will continue to be the case. A third point worth mentioning, of course, is the issue of remittances and diasporas. One of the results of Brexit has been the significant fall in the value of the pound, which in turn has affected remittances We have a significant number of people of Bangladeshi origin in Britain, as indeed would be the case for most Commonwealth countries. And many of them do send back money back home to support various causes and indeed to support investment projects. So that too will have an implication. But finally, and I think that is going to be the main thrust of our discussion today, is to really try and understand the enormity of the task that is going to be required in terms of looking at the implications, particularly in the area of trade and investment, in the post-Brexit period, and the need for extensive research. We in the Ramphal Institute are quite willing and happy to be of assistance in supporting the research work that will be required, and indeed we would like to see the event today as a kind of first step in the direction of addressing the many issues and problems that will need to be addressed in the days and months ahead. Thank you, and congratulations again, Edwin, and thanks for organizing this event.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for this. And my next task is to introduce the next speaker, who is only, as he was reminding us, has been in post for only 6 months at the Secretariat, but he's an old hand in this, and he is quite well known in the Brussels circuit, because this was where we first met in Brussels, and I'm sure that he's met many good friends from those days. He is Paolo Kautoke, who is the Director of Trade Policy at the Commonwealth Secretariat. Director, you've got the floor.
Edwin, I'll just make one brief correction.
Yes.
My colleague Dr. Razak has pointed out, I should have said our exports to the UK are $3 billion. I believe I used the word 300 million. I was 10.
Oh, well, what are a couple of pounds amongst friends?
Thank you, Edwin. Mrs. Patson, Ambassador Farouk Shubai, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure for us from the Secretariat to participate in this event's brainstorming. And I think it's the common word now, Brexit, but now the focus should be on post-Brexit and the impact it's going to have on developing countries. And I would like to take the opportunity to share some of the reflections we have from the Commonwealth. Because when the UK is leaving the European Union, the related developments already impacting on developing countries. We look at the transmission channels through which Commonwealth developing countries are going to be affected, which include trade, investment, remittances, as mentioned by the two speakers previously, overseas development aid, the performance of the UK economy going forward, and also UK's global influence on trade and development issues. Over the medium to long term, the repercussion through these channels will be determined by the nature of trade deals the UK can secure with the European Union and the trading arrangement with the ACP countries. As you all know, that the UK is the world's 5th largest economy. 6. just missed by a few points. Generating a flows of 1.6 trillion US dollars. This is in 2015. And it has steadily diversified its trade with developing economies, and which accounts for about 25% of its total goods trade, or less than 15% in 2000. The United Kingdom is also important export destination for many ACP countries, as already been explained before. And this is most evident in the case of CARICOM, where the share of total trade with UK has contracted because of this. And when you are still looking at the implementation of the EPA, this is really happening, the contraction in trade with the United Kingdom. And notwithstanding the implementation of the EU, there are brighter sides, like the sub-Saharan Africa, for example, have doubled their merchandise trade to the UK over the period 2000 to 2014, from 8 billion to 16 billion US dollars. Although the information on trade in services is not readily available, it is a matter of fact that the UK has been one of the most important drivers of services exports to many of tourism-dependent ACP countries. Remittances, as been explained before, are also quite high for several ACP countries. The UK's commitment to trade-led economic development has been laudable and globally influential. It has always recognized and championed the special challenges faced particularly by sub-Saharan Africa and small vulnerable states. As mentioned before, it is one of the few high-income countries which have reached the target of 0.7%. And as mentioned by B.I. Combs, its contribution to development, official development assistance, especially the EDF, is quite significant. Given the above backdrop, the aftermath of the referendum result, we have already seen telltale signs, causing concerns for many developing countries. And as the pound, for example, depreciates, as mentioned before, countries have lost the purchasing power of their export receipts, remittances, aid resources, which is close to up to 2 billion. And since the financial crisis, the world economy has been seen subdue the global trade and economic activities. The uncertainties caused by Brexit can weaken the world economic recovery prospects, undermining the development interest of Commonwealth developing and ACP countries as well. Colleagues, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, we all acknowledge the challenges associated with reformulating, revising and reshaping trade regimes involving the UK, the European Union and ACP countries. The list of possible outcomes at this stage is extensive, and the legal issues involved with each of the possible options are going to be endless. Under this challenging environment, it is extremely important to reassure the global community's commitment to promoting development as reflected in Sustainable Development Goals. In this regard, I believe the following 5 principles should be accorded urgent attention. First, the global economies, particularly the high-income countries and relatively advanced developing countries, and the global financial institutions, must undertake the required measures to minimize the short-term uncertainties. Amongst others, exchange rate volatilities can have detrimental impact on trade flows and investment decisions. Closer cooperation is also important to boost global economic and trading activities. Second, the upcoming trade negotiations between the United Kingdom and the European Union and the development of trading arrangements between the United Kingdom and capacity-constrained developing countries must ensure that Brexit does not result in unfavourable outcomes for the latter. And indeed, the UK's newfound trade policy sovereignty should result in improvements of the currently existing trade deals for ACP states and LDCs. Third, Brexit-related new trade negotiations and discussions should not distract the attention that is needed to revive and revitalise the global multilateral trading system. In the aftermath of Nairobi Ministerial Conference, not at least the fact that WTO, the Doha round, has now been running for about 50 years, finding concrete solution to the current stalemate is one of the most pressing needs for the multilateral cooperation. Without a vibrant multilateral trading system, it will be very difficult to promote and protect the trade and development interests of vulnerable developing countries. This is particularly so when a number of trade-related development goals in the SDGs are linked to the Doha round-related issues. Fourth, the global trade slowdown should not be used as a pretext to reduce support for trade capacity building in developing countries. International trade remains and will continue to be vital for ACP countries and LDCs for promoting their economic development and achieving structural transformation. African countries have embarked upon an ambitious trade agenda leading to continent-wide integration and industrialization. This effort must be supported to secure dividends that will also help realize the sustainable development goals. Small states, trade challenges need to be addressed effectively to promote their international competitiveness and to help them tackle other vulnerabilities, including those arising from climate change related issues. As you are aware, that in collaboration with the European Commission and the OIF, the Commonwealth Secretariat has been implementing the Hubs and Spokes project, providing long-term capacity building support. With the unfolding of Brexit-related events, enhancement and continuation of this support cannot be overstated. Finally, UK's role in promoting development must continue. There has been a serious concern about whether exiting from the EU will lead to its reduced global clout. Some analysts are also of the view that Brexit could mean reduced efforts by the EU on the development issues, in the absence of bigger push from the United Kingdom. In a post-Brexit world, the United Kingdom's strong advocacy and lobbying role in ensuring development-friendly outcomes in such areas as global trade, climate change, governance, will remain important and need to be leveraged through enhanced cooperation with such organizations as the ACP Group and the Commonwealth. While devising its own policy regime, the United Kingdom must set examples for other developed countries and exert influence through such forums as the G7 and the G20. Before I conclude, I must stress that the Commonwealth Secretariat now has a comprehensive trade work program spanning from trade policy and advocacy, trade competitiveness, and technical assistance. We stand ready to work collaboratively with our members, both the UK as well as other ACP and Asian developing countries. I'm pleased to see that all the issues I have raised here will be discussed here today, and I look forward to hearing all the views in the discussion. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Paolo. The next speaker is the Honorable Sarah Flood-Bobran, but unfortunately, due to technical reasons, she is not able to connect to us. She had fortunately sent the text of a presentation which I've had the opportunity to read, and it really is excellent. But given the time pressures, I will not read it, but merely indicate the key highlights of it, and afterwards we will circulate it in its entirety to you all and place it on our website. In her presentation, she commended the Institute for quickly bringing together this diverse group of experts to assess and advise on what Brexit would mean for Commonwealth developing countries and their exports under the EPA. She went on to say that the EPA and the previous arrangements, Lomé and Cotonou, were not necessarily ideal. They were far from perfect, but they offered a framework within which trade actually could actually be conducted, and countries small countries like hers were able to actually trade successfully internationally. In a post-Brexit era, worst scenario, she points out is that the UK ceases to apply benefits, and there's no replacement for them. If this worst-case scenario, of course, it would be a disaster because the country and many others would lose their key exports. So what the objective, as she points out now, in all of this is to ensure that post-Brexit era, small Commonwealth countries and other developing countries of the ACP group will be able to continue to export UK on a viable and remunerative basis. That is the bottom line. And for that, she points out there will be two requirements. One, a continuation of the duty-free access arrangements, and secondly, which is the converse to that, to a certain extent, that the protective arrangements where there are tariffs on higher costs, or lower cost competitors, these tariffs are maintained. And she concludes by saying that it should be appreciated that Commonwealth countries have deep and long-lasting relations with the UK in the areas of trade, commerce and investment, as well as the political, cultural and social affairs. And Brexit should be an opportunity to foster rather than damage those links. So this is what has been said by the MP, and as I say, the full text will be circulated later. We've now come to the end of the formal opening session, and we'll be moving now into the business side of things. We hope, although the structure of the room is fairly formally laid out, we are really expecting quite an interactive discussion. We have, as our chair mentioned at the beginning, we have a very large online audience. They will be able to participate, and I've been asked to remind you of the hashtag Brexit EPAs, if you do want to send in your comments, questions, etc. The first substantive item on the agenda is the background and overview. We will be having two persons introducing this. The first, and in fact I'll ask if he could come online, because he'll be joining us by Skype from Jamaica. He is Ambassador Ransford Smith. He is a former Deputy Secretary General of the Commonwealth Secretariat. He has also been Permanent Secretary in Jamaica and permanent representative of his country to the WTO, and he currently is a trustee of the Ramphal Institute. He will make the first introduction of this next subject, which is the overview of this situation, provide some background. I'd be asking all presenters to stick within, say, just 2 to 4 minutes for the introduction before we go into the presentation. I think that Ambassador Smith is getting ready. Although we're not seeing your very handsome face, Ambassador. Yes, I think we are, but it's you seem to be a bit on the side. Is this our problem, or? I don't. Can you hear us, Ransford? We cannot hear you.
Turn the volume up.
We suspect that your mic might be muted. When possibly could we, whilst the technical arrangements are being sorted, could I propose a change of the order? It was more logical having Ransford's first, but so as not to waste time, could I suggest that we have David address us first. Now, David Jessup is with the Caribbean Council. He has been with the council for very many years, and the Caribbean Council, as most of you know, has been in the forefront of commercial collaboration between the Caribbean region and the UK. Initially, it focused just on the Commonwealth, but has now extended its remit to the wider Caribbean. So could I invite David Jessup to make the first introduction? David.
Excellencies, Madam Chair, ladies and gentlemen, my presentation is going to be very informal, and hopefully it complements some of the earlier more formal presentations. My background, in a sense, is having actually worked particularly with the Caribbean, but with both the CARIFORUM countries, Dominican Republic and others on previous trade negotiations, whether they're Lomé, Cotonou or the EPA negotiations. And so what I actually want to talk about is process, the actual process, because one of the things I learned by working with Caribbean industries and Caribbean governments is that unless you have the capacity to begin to look over the horizon, develop the intelligence as to what is going on, you actually find it extremely difficult to negotiate. And while quite rightly we're at this very early stage looking at some of the key general issues, the reality is that fairly soon we're going to have to start talking about the details. As we all know, I mean, the British government has said in the last 24 hours effectively that they anticipate that the Article 50 issue will be triggered probably in the early part of next year. And during this unusual sort of 6-month period of reflection, we have a rather strange situation. We actually have 3 ministries that are involved, plus the Prime Minister. It is far from clear how those 3 ministries are to interrelate, although the indication is that you will have the Foreign Office, who will be responsible for diplomacy. You will end up with the Ministry of International Trade that will be negotiating with all of the countries other than Europe, and you'll end up with the Brexit Ministry solely responsible for negotiations with Europe. Now, what that implies is that during the course of the next 6 months, not only are each of those ministries, presumably under the direction of the Prime Minister, going to be developing their own approaches, but somebody then has to bring it together. So in my view, the most likely outcome of this will be the identification of options and probably the publication of a white paper towards the end of this year. Whether that white paper will be presented to Parliament, whether Parliament will then have to vote on which of the options that the government recommends is far from clear. But the important thing that I see in terms of process is whether it is from an ACP perspective, a CARICOM, CARIFORUM or any other perspective, is that during this period of reflection, whatever grouping or whatever country it is shouldn't stand back. Because already we've seen in the last 24 hours the United States beginning to have a very informal dialogue with the British government about future trade options. And the inclination, which I've observed in 4 webinars, other events I've been involved in the Caribbean in the last week, is a wait-and-see kind of attitude. And I think that is absolutely wrong, so I really commend this initiative, and I hope the Rampal Institute can begin to take forward some of those ideas. One of the issues that I've noticed, and this is a particularly Caribbean context, is, and the point was raised a little bit earlier on, is in relation to the EPA. CARIFORUM obviously has an EPA, but one of the issues that I think is going to arise very rapidly in the Caribbean is which grouping is going to, if there is a negotiation with the United Kingdom from a CARIFORUM perspective, is it CARICOM, is it CARIFORUM, is it CARIFORUM plus Cuba, which is now engaged in a dialogue with the European Union, or is it even, because there's another very complex issue in the Caribbean, is it CARIFORUM plus Cuba plus the overseas territories, which potentially have a first call on the United Kingdom's time for a negotiation. And I think, given time constraints, etc., and Edwin's comments, what I think I'd just like to end by saying is something that I've observed in the context of the webinars I've been involved in the Caribbean, is a different kind of dialogue, and this perhaps is quite challenging for this group. It is how relevant, how important is the United Kingdom? Because one of the things I've heard in the Caribbean is, does it matter? Is China more important? Is the United States more important? And where that leads you, which hasn't been done, and I noticed one of the earlier speakers, I think you sir, were saying, is there's absolutely critical that there is a detailed analysis looking at the trade figures, goods and services, because another thing I'd stress is for the Caribbean, services, despite the fact that sugar, bananas, etc. are big employers, in terms of contribution to GDP, tourism is absolutely critical. And what is not really understood is that in context of the relationship between Caribbean tourism and the European Union, it's not just about the obvious things like currency valuations, it's about regulation. And it's about regulation, for instance, in terms of the tour operators, the air services agreements, and a whole range of other issues. So for me, let me end by saying is that while there's clearly a commonality of interest across the ACP, some very, very big questions which I think will create major tensions within the group will arise once we know what the United Kingdom is proposing as far as third countries are concerned. So let me stop there.
Thank you very much, David. So, I must apologize for the earlier technical glitch, but I'm assured that you now have Ransford online now.
Yes, I hope you can hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes, very clearly. We don't
fine.
see you
Thank you
because of the positioning, I suspect, of your camera, but we can hear you.
Well, I think it's more important to hear me, Edwin, than to see me. Thank you very much, and let me also, even though this is a business part of the session, I would be remiss if I didn't express my appreciation, certainly, and my congratulations to the Rampal Institute, to its chair, to you, the executive director, and to all others involved in convening this event so swiftly to help developing countries, and particularly Commonwealth developing countries, in responding to the new situation with which we are faced. I will shorten my remarks considerably, bearing in mind what has been said before. I think it is very important, first of all, that we reflect not just on the UK's relative importance in size and political influence within the EU, which is well known and widely acknowledged, but more importantly, on the UK's importance in the EU's relationship with developing countries, and especially to ACP countries and the 39 Commonwealth developing countries that are members of the ACP group of states. In 2014 participants, the European Union imported 834 billion euros in goods from developing countries. The United Kingdom was the third largest EU importing member, just behind Germany and the Netherlands. In the case of the LDCs, 13 of which are Commonwealth members, the EU imported from them in 2014 $38.1 billion worth of goods, and the UK was the second largest single EU importing member, buying LDC products valued at 5.3 billion euros. And in regard to Africa as a whole, the EU exported in 2013 $153 billion and imported 168 billion euros. I'm sorry, the first figure was euros. The UK again was the fourth largest importer of the EU 28. And for CARICOM, in the 5 years between 2010 and 2014, UK was the main trading partner, accounting on average for more than a fifth of the region's exports to the European Union. Finally, and I think David mentioned, in the area of trade and services, the UK's position is even more dominant. The country is by far the largest EU exporter of services and is also the second largest importer of services among the EU 28. According to preliminary data for 2015, the UK exported 188.8 billion euros in services to countries outside the EU, and it imported 95.4 billion euros. Indeed, in 2015, the UK's services exports exceeded Germany's next strongest performers by more than 60 billion euros. I think while we are fully aware, of course, that until the triggering of Article 50, the negotiations on the Brexit and the withdrawal of the UK, much will remain the same. But I think we should be careful not to overstate the comfort that such a hiatus may provide. For one thing, the negotiating process itself will be laying down markers towards the future. And as well, there will be the unavoidable element of uncertainty that is inherent in Brexit. The markets make their judgments about tomorrow today. And unfortunately, in terms of impact and consequences, it is often secondary whether those judgments eventually turn out to be valid or not. In short, we have to act as quickly as possible to develop our responses to Brexit across the ACP group of countries. And I am reminded by reading recently the autobiography of Sir Sridhar Ramphal, whose name this institute bears, where he emphasizes that when Britain joined the EEC then in 1973, the ACP group of countries moved quickly to establish a common position, to set mutual priorities, and to develop a common agenda. Now we have effectively the mirror image of those developments in the early 1970s. And I believe that the same level of collaboration, coordination is required in our response. And the Commonwealth Secretariat and the ACP group of realistic Brexit, and the ultimate bilateral trade agreements between the UK and EPA countries. Or 4, embarking on a process of negotiating entirely new or substantively new WTO consistent preferential trade agreements between the UK and EPA countries. This brainstorming, and again kudos to the Ramphal Institute, is taking place at the incipient stage of the discussion we need to have. I would nevertheless venture the opinion that either of the last two options, or indeed some mix of both, will be optimal, providing the opportunity to take into account any missed opportunities in the earlier concluded EPA negotiations, and possibly room to insert matters of a special interest and focus to specific regions, particularly given the differing market context posed by the UK as opposed to the EU. But without seeking, in my view at least, to treat the UK ACP negotiating process as a clean slate, as a tabula rasa. It should be noted that in all these four options would remain potentially applicable, whether or not the UK exits the EU altogether, chooses to negotiate a bilateral free trade agreement with the EU, or chooses the so-called Norwegian option of unfettered access to the single market. Now, there are a range of other issues that will rightly concentrate the minds of policymakers in London and in the Commonwealth and ACP capitals into the foreseeable future and, unfortunately, well beyond. These include the growth performance of the UK, the EU, and the wider global economy, of which both the UK and the EU are important constituent parts. To the trajectory of sterling, which may have implications for its role as a reserve currency, and will certainly have implications for tourism flows and for the purchasing power of remittances. 3, the future of funding benefits enjoyed by the overseas territories and countries and territories, which in the Caribbean are mainly British and Dutch, and which now have access to the EDF and to the European Investment Bank. 4, potential uncertainty regarding EU and UK development assistance at a time when the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals will place new demands on this particular source of funding. And in regard to development assistance, I think that will be an interesting issue to follow, to watch very closely. The UK is, of course, made the third largest contributor to the EDF, providing almost 15% of its resources. The worst case scenario could be a reduction in the EDF and a retrenchment of UK direct bilateral and regional assistance, depending on the evolution, depending on the interplay of political forces within the UK domestic political environment. The outgoing Prime Minister, to his credit, was an unreserved and unstinting supporter of development assistance, and one of the consequences of that was, of course, the UK being amongst the largest relative and absolute donors amongst the developing countries. There's, of course, always a possibility that funds that would have gone to the EDF will go directly
Well, I'm not sure what has happened here, but anyway, I think what has been explained and introduced by David and Ransford really set us up for a very interesting discussion. I would want to suggest that instead of going straight into the open discussion, we go to the next presenter, who in fact will be reminding us that all of this discussion we're having, not about now but about the future. And sometimes in those discussions which we have as to how countries should move forward, etc., the perspective of the young people, those who will actually be having to live through whatever is decided on now, needs really to be taken into account. There is the president of the ACP, Young Professionals Network, which operates out of Brussels, but it's a Europe-wide network. The president she's also an expert on the future of EU ACP relations. So I'd want to invite her. She will be joining us from Skype from Brussels. I want to invite her to give us the perspective of the youth on all of this. So Yentil Williams, you have the floor. Can you hear Yentil? I want to invite her to give us the perspective of the youth on all of it. So Yentil Williams, you have the floor.
Hi Edwin, hello all, can you hear me?
Can you hear Yentil?
Hi, can you hear me?
Could I ask you, Yentil, to mute the live stream? Because that's what's coming through.
Hi Edwin, hello all, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Could I ask you?
The YouTube that's playing, that's why she has this right.
Okay, I've switched off my YouTube, so I think I heard you. If you can hear me, I will start. Well, Edwin, thank you to the Ramphal Institute for really allowing the ACP Young Professional Network to fulfill our mission to play an active role in policy-making processes. And it's so important to have the youth voice in this debate, as you said, because we will inherit the policies of today. The UK referendum results are important, and especially how the youth voted is very important. So we know that 51.9% of the 72% of voters voted for the UK to leave the EU, while 48.1% of this 72% of voters voted for the UK to remain. In this debate, the youth voice has been obscured somewhat. The YouGov poll predicts that 75% of 18 to 24-year-olds wanted to remain. Therefore, the youth population overwhelmingly wanted to remain. These results for us show the importance of including youth in youth policy-making processes, and this is what ACP-YPN strives to do actively, not just at the EU and ACP level, but also with the African Union, with Commonwealth, and with the UN. And we're doing a lot of work on the SDGs and youth inclusion in this in particular. Now, on the EPAs and a possible Brexit, and what is looking each day as a more and more likely Brexit, many of the challenges are similar to those that we invoked in the conference that Ramphal Institute pioneered on TTIP and the implications for ACP a few weeks ago at the LSE. In this scenario, I think it is important to again evoke what Sir Sridhar Ramphal said in his memoirs, that the challenge that faces developing countries is not merely the challenge of economic development, but the fact that in failure lies the danger of returning to a new dependency, a new kind of colonialism deriving from economic weakness. I think it's important to evoke this because not only in the TTIP scenario is this correct, but it also applies for possible Brexit scenarios, as many of the challenges remain the same. In the TTIP scenario, we know, regardless, the EU has already stated in its trade and investment strategy that FTAs can serve as a laboratory for global trade liberalization, and this can be explored starting with countries that have close relationships with the EU and the US and that are ready to meet this high level of ambition. In this case, we can imagine that the UK would also be part of TTIP, and if the UK does break away earlier, the UK could indeed conclude an agreement with the US before the other EU 27 states are able to do so. So by extension with the EPAs, I think we face many of the same structural challenges here again. In this case, there may not be radical changes, but there are a lot of radical messages for ACP countries. And from this, I have 3 recommendations. The first is that ACP and Commonwealth countries get their house in order, especially in with the agenda for economic transformation. And this is even more urgent for ACP countries in the run-up to post-Cotonou negotiations, which have to start in a year and a half from now. So whilst the deadline is 2020, negotiations have to begin in 2018. That's very soon. Secondly, I recommend that ACP and Commonwealth countries continue to engage on key trade issues being discussed in other fora, on the EPAs, on TTIP. And I believe one of the challenges going forward is to ensure continued market access, and not just market access, but market penetration to the other EU 27 member states. Thirdly, ACP and Commonwealth countries must continue, must pioneer youth mainstreaming, which currently does not exist, but there's a beautiful UN ECOSOC text on gender mainstreaming, which we can also use for youth mainstreaming. And ACP and Commonwealth countries, by extension, must foster an enabling environment for youth and youth organizations. In lieu of conclusion, I think it's important to note where youth are in the economic partnership agreements. And so far, the CARIFORUM Economic Partnership Agreement is the only agreement which refers to young people in 2 cases. Once in Article 191, in reference to the 2006 ECOSOC, UN ECOSOC Declaration on Full Employment and Decent Work, and on Article number 5 on monitoring of the EPA agreement. In sum, we do not see a big fallout for youth, in particular within the EPA, bearing in mind that it's a UN declaration that this refers to, we have seen that we've been somewhat marginalized in any case in EU-ACP relations due to the underutilization of Article 26 of the Cotonou Partnership Agreement on youth issues, but we do see it as urgent to move forward on this. It is important and urgent to improve youth inclusion in policy-making processes so that we can co-create this future that these agreements promise us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, what I consider to be really the essential perspective for our discussions. I now want to invite Dr. Laurent Bartels, who is a law lecturer at Cambridge. He has the good fortune of being neither ACP, so he's not within the, he does not have an EPA, he does not have to wear an EPA hat. Neither is he European. He's Australian, which is I'm not sure in terms of trade whether that will always be considered a good thing. But he would be able, I think, to give us a valuable, objective position or an idea of how all of this will work, because we live in a WTO world, and we cannot ignore that in whatever happens, because the UK will continue to be part of the WTO. All of the EPA countries will continue to be part of the WTO, and the WTO's remit will continue. So, Laurent, you've got the floor.
Well, thanks very much, everyone, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be involved with the Ramphel Institute and also on this topic. Yes, I am Australian, and so, welcome to 1973. What I'm going to explain is how bad the situation now is for the ACP, and hopefully how it can be a little bit better than it turned out to be for Australia, and of course even worse for New Zealand. When the UK actually joined what was then the EEC. So first of all, what's the situation if nothing happens in terms of negotiations? The UK drops out of the EU whenever 50 is triggered plus 2 years. And this means, with nothing else changing, that the rules that apply between the UK and the EU, obviously, but also the UK and all third countries, including ACP countries, that becomes regulated by WTO rules. So what are WTO rules that are applicable? Well, if you read around on the blogosphere, you'll see a whole lot of different opinions, so let me add another one. In my view, what the Director General of the WTO indicated when he came to London some time ago, which is that the UK will have to rejoin the WTO as an accession country, is wrong. And it's flat out wrong. I can say, I think, that the Director General was not speaking in a fully legally informed capacity. The UK is, of course, a full WTO member, and it has ratified the WTO agreements, which means that all of WTO law applies to the UK, all of the rights and all of the obligations. This is straightforward enough when it comes to the rights. The question is, what does one do with the obligations? And here one can divide between the standard rule type obligations, which are straightforward, and scheduled commitments, both in goods and in services. Now here there is also a difference of view. There are some who say that, well, the UK has to negotiate from scratch. I don't really understand that. If one takes the perspective that the UK is somehow outside of the system when it comes to schedules, the obvious implication is that the UK can do whatever it likes. It's unbound. That seems to me to be an unrealistic interpretation. I think what's much more likely to happen, I think by analogy with the law on state succession, is that the UK will simply keep the EU scheduled commitments. Now, what are these scheduled commitments and what does it mean in terms of the position of, well, I could say something about the UK or the EU, but in particular third countries? Well, if we look at goods, that's basically the MFN tariff, but what's of particular interest to ACP countries is that would also include the GSP tariff, and that would also include everything but arms, or the equivalent of everything but arms, so duty-free, quota-free access for least developed countries. In fact, I think the position of least developed countries doesn't change at all. In terms of services, it would be whatever the schedules are, and these are done on a country-by-country basis within the EU, so that is really very straightforward. It would just be the UK's commitments there. And it would also include, relevantly, the services waiver for LDCs. So I think there things are fairly straightforward. The only real point of complication is what does one do with subsidy commitments and what does one do with TRQs. And I honestly don't think this is such a big deal. Alan Matthews, the agriculturalist, has written very well on this, I think, and has pointed out that the UK doesn't subsidise up to the level of the AMS commitment, either on a paying in or on a getting out basis, which is of course less. In terms of TRQs, well, the UK is a relatively, compared to the rest of the EU, liberal trading country. I don't see much of a problem in terms of import TRQs. And in terms of export TRQs, unless I've missed some major data, and I haven't looked at this 100%, but my initial scan of the data is that probably what's affected is UK exports of cheddar to the United States. I can't really see too much else that comes under export TRQ. So, in other words, I think the UK is in a pretty strong position. I don't think it needs to negotiate a thing, really, most likely. Or if it does have to negotiate, probably relatively minor. Now, that's important because one might think that from the ACP side, it can hold the UK over the WTO. And I don't think that's the case. Now, what does that mean for ACP countries? Well, it means, as I said, that they are just like any other third country. They're in no better a position, other than, of course, insofar as our developing countries and least developed countries and so on, than any other third country. This is fairly standard. One might think that games could be played with the economic partnership agreements. After all, the UK is a party to the economic partnership agreements under what is a principle which everybody is now becoming more familiar with, mixity, mixed member state EU agreements, and so one might be tempted to think that because the UK continues to be a member that somehow the magic will not go away. I have to tell you the magic dies, but not because the UK is not a member of these agreements, rather because all FTAs with the EU have within them a territorial application clause which says that they only apply on the EU side to the territory of the EU. So yes, the UK would be a member, but actually the treaty, the EPAs and so on, don't apply in reality because they don't apply to the UK's territory. And that's a pretty significant point. So, what is to be done, to quote not Lenin, but rather the person that he plagiarized along with Tolstoy, Chernyshevsky in 1863? Well, one option is to amend the economic partnership agreements. Of course, lawyers can do anything if you pay them enough money. That is a possibility, but it's a bit of an awkward thing to do. Because the economic partnership agreements are predicated on essentially bilateral, at least on the EU side, trading relationships. So it would require a huge amount of cooperation with the EU, and there would be institutional implications. Of course, it could be done, but I think it's probably rather unlikely. Which means that the alternative is either one is happy with the existing GSP, one would obviously be happy with the existing everything but arms arrangement. But if one is not happy with the GSP, which is the default position, then there are two options. One is haggle with the UK for a better GSP, and that might not be such a bad option. We're talking about goods, obviously. And the second, and this is what would be required if the UK doesn't play ball, and must be required if one is interested in services, as the Caribbean in particular is interested in new FTAs. That seems to me to be the inevitable outcome. There have to be new FTAs. When should these moves, negotiations, contracts, advices all be kicked off? Well, now we come to EU law. Article 50. Well, we all know about Article 50. We've all become experts in what we're often told is the UK Constitution, still to see that in a documentary form, so I don't quite believe it exists, but anyway. But what's relevant now is what Article 50 means for the UK's ability to negotiate. And the two positions here are relatively straightforward. Ordinarily, an EU member state is not allowed to negotiate on trade. Why? Because of Article 207, which gives the EU the exclusive competence to deal with trade. Everybody, I think, here and out there in the world will no doubt know this. And some people say, well, that continues to apply to the UK and that continues to apply to the EU, even after Article 50 has been triggered. And I think this is highly unlikely. It strikes me, and of course, as a lawyer, I am not averse to reading things into the text, but it strikes me that in the absence of an instruction in the text of the EU treaties that say that the UK, a country leaving the EU, is not able to negotiate trade agreements before it is kicked out of the system, and that, by the way, I think includes trade agreements with the EU. I think one really has to take the view that Article 207, along with the duty of loyal cooperation, read in light of Article 50, this is not a very difficult legal argument to make, means that trade negotiations with third countries and with the EU can take place the day that an Article 50 notification is made. That is a conclusion that I think not only makes sense, but much more difficult also makes legal sense. So that is, I think, where we are. In short, I think it would be unwise for ACP countries to sit by the sidelines and wait. I know third countries are sitting there waiting. I know the European Commission is sitting there waiting. And I know that the UK would be sitting there waiting if it had anybody in government who knew how to sit and wait on matters like international trade. But I don't think that's a good idea. It strikes me that there is a lot of lobbying to be done, there is a lot of negotiation, informally at least, and later on formally to be done, and that should be started now because Brexit will happen. And I think that really can happen, legally speaking, in a formal way, as soon as an Article 50 notification is made, and there is quite a lot at stake. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lauren. You always renew my faith in law lecturers. you like so many others, you don't send us to sleep. Anyway, but in terms of substance, my suggestion would be that we move now into the discussion, given that the issues, the subjects we've just discussed, have some very systemic linkages going right through. So I would open the floor for comments, suggestions, questions. The only request I'd make would be, before you, as you speak rather, you introduce yourself and you be brief. So the floor is open. I know that David, with the formula of the European Commission, David, and afterwards Paul.
Well, cool. I just wanted to, I don't like taking issue with Lauren because he knows much more law than I do. But I am a bit more worried than he is about the absence of UK schedule. And I can understand why the Director General of the WTO said that the UK would de facto be applying as a new member. Because when a new member applies to join the EU, the WTO, no one says we can't come in. The problem is agreeing the schedules. It took Russia, I think, 20 years to agree the schedule. Now, if the most obvious way in which the UK can have its schedules, apart from agriculture, which is much more difficult, is indeed to assume that it inherits the EU's Paris schedule. And maybe that is what a panel, an appellate body, would decide. The problem in the WTO is that when there are two views, there is only one way of resolving it in practice. In theory, you can have a vote. And we try to have a vote when the US is trying to interpret the dispute in a way which no Christian would read it. But no one wanted to vote against the United States, a dispute they were concerned in. And the only way to get that resolved was for the parties to do what they thought was right, and then eventually the outcome was determined by a panel. So, if in the WTO the UK comes along and says, Mr. Martin, whatever you've never come across in these matters, thinks we're entitled to apply the EU schedule, even though we're no longer part of the EU customs. Someone else might say, oh, no, you've been a member since 1948, you had a schedule until 1973. That is your schedule, subject, of course, to adjustment to take account of all the trade round since. Mark is looking extremely sceptical, and I'm sure if I was the UK division, a very unlikely eventuality, I must say, I would say this is most unfair, this is unreasonable. We're going to go ahead, if we can't agree with you, we're going to go ahead and apply tariffs upon the basis of the EU schedule. Then we have to wait for a while to see if anyone challenges it, which probably someone would, because if you looked at those two alternatives, we would give very much lower tariffs on agriculture than the UK. So this part of the country might possibly disagree with me. Then you would call a panel. Then whatever the panel result would be appealed, and all this process would take 2 to 3 years. And until that was over, no one would be certain about what tariff the UK should apply. And while that was uncertain, whether Mr. Leon Fox likes to go around the world with a pin on it or whatever, asking people whether they want to be really agreement with this, the first question I think any well-advised country would say is, what tariffs are you prepared to give up? Because we don't know what your tariff schedule is. to come back when you do know.
This is very fundamental point. Paul, unless it was following up, I would want to ask.
I'd rather,
Laurent, please.
Yeah, because there are so many points, and I don't have much of a memory, and I don't want to forget them. Well, let me begin by saying that I probably disagree with David even more, because even though he professes not to understand the law, of course he does, and he's got experience in this system that I could only dream of. And this is a system that is based on common sense, and in the past, rather than law, but now I'd like to say as much as the law. But I still do disagree, because the difference between the UK and Russia or China or some is that the UK is in a different default position. It is a member. Now, what does that mean? It means you have to look at the obligations that it has as a member, and you have essentially three options. I didn't mention this third option. One option is it hasn't said anything about schedule, so it doesn't have to. That's the logical conclusion. Secondly, the option that I think is more likely is it keeps the EU schedule. And thirdly, yes, you're right, there could be an argument that it goes back to the old UK schedule, but I can't see how that's going to be good for any other countries. I don't know what that schedule looks like, but I would presume it was a damn sight more protectionist than the EU schedule now. So it seems to me, all right, but then the UK isn't that protectionist when it comes to things like that anyway. I don't think I actually don't think that much hinges on it particularly. So these seem to me to be the options. I think that looking at this from the perspective of the UK being an accession country is just the wrong perspective. The UK doesn't have to do anything. The UK is either in a fantastic position with no schedule, or it's in the same position, or it's in maybe a better position, except for maybe agriculture. In terms of the consensus rule in voting, I don't think that comes into it for exactly the same reason. The only way this is going to be resolved is by dispute settlement, because the UK is there. There is no political dimension to it. And now I know that I'm going against what is common wisdom in the WTO as well. But I simply can't see why there is a political dimension. The UK can just sit there happily and wait for a challenge. I also don't think there's any uncertainty if that happens. You've got 4 years, sure, with the panels and the appeals and the implementations and the this and the that, but so what? While that is going on, you have the UK's whatever it wants to do, which I think would be the equivalent to the EU schedule, we keep that. There's no uncertainty there. The uncertainty might arise if the panel or the appellate body decides that that was the wrong thing to do. And it's just the same as with any other case. I don't see it's such a big deal.
Thank you. A quick comeback, but just organizational. Could I suggest then for pick up, we only have this area, so if you would come up to this area to speak for sound capture.
Am I close enough now?
Probably, well, and also this will apply to everyone else later on. This area, this is the only area for sound capture.
My question was simply how one interprets the obligation not to apply a tariff in excess of your schedule, but if you have no schedule, does it mean no tariff or any tariff?
No tariff. I mean, sorry, no, any tariff, any tariff. No, of course any tariff, because if you don't have a commitment, you're undone. Very simple.
We've got Paul more than Lindy.
There's no connection, all right.
But Paul, is this on the same theme?
No.
Okay. David, if you don't mind, because our online audience are very important. Yes, if you don't mind.
If you could repeat the question.
So I'm sorry, it's a very brief question, and it's a question that was raised with me this morning by a very senior economist in the Republic. And it's a question about Iraq. And he's asking me the question, what happens if we withdrew from the EPA and joined Central America to negotiate a new agreement with the United Kingdom? And that appears to me to have a direct relationship on the answer you were giving. Well, sounds to me like that would make a lot of sense. Well, it would be a new negotiation. It's just the format of the negotiation.
But what then happens to the rest of the Caribbean context, the EPA and the United Kingdom?
No, but the EPA with the United Kingdom is dead. It doesn't exist anymore as far as the UK is out. So, because of the territorial application clause, it's just dead.
So Paul, is this on the Sheila, are you on the scene?
Yes.
Yes, so please, you can. Yeah.
I want to raise 2 points. First, you seem a little overconfident about GSP and EBA. They are EU measures. They're also discretionary measures. Yes, obviously the UK could therefore renew them, or it could simply stop them, couldn't it? And surely it'd be more likely to have its own UK-designed version of GSP. I can remember back in the pre-EU days, DFID and its predecessors spent a lot of time trying to define what a UK GSP should look like. And secondly, what about all the other bits of trade? We don't have much of an anti-dumping law. We don't have very much of a countervailing mechanism. How would you expect the UK to be able to get these created and agreed to the WTO?
Yes. Okay, well, there is obviously a difference. Is this microphone? All right. So there's obviously a difference between a bound commitment, which is an obligation, not a right, and the actual tariff that one applies. So all that means is that you can't go above the bound tariff. Underneath the bound tariff, it's always unilateral, and MFN tariff, applied tariff, is also unilateral and, well, voluntary. Let's say unilateral. Voluntary is old language, I think, that don't need to worry. That can lead to misinterpretations, I think. It's still legally binding and has to be applied non-discriminatory, on a non-discriminatory basis, and so on. So, in practice, of course, the UK can raise a tariff up to the bound amount, and it can abolish the GSP if it wants, and it can abolish the duty-free, quota-free if it wants. And that's exactly why I suggest, in fact, it's up for grabs, and that's why I suggested doing something the opposite way around, which is negotiating with the UK for a better deal on that. In terms of anti-dumping and countervailing duties and safeguards and so on, well, that's all pretty run-of-the-mill stuff. I mean, as soon as you get your Trade Department, you do an anti-dumping investigation, you impose anti-dumping duties. I don't see that that's a big issue at all. I don't understand the controversy there.
Thank you.
Well, they've got manpower, but they're hiring people by the dozen. All those people who are not getting Belgian passports are going to come back to the UK.
Yeah, good point. Yeah. So I just want the largest view on whether it's relatively easy to take the existing EPA texts and tweak them so that they would be applicable to the UK.
Well, as the basis of a negotiation document, I suppose so. Of course, it depends where the ACP products are going. I mean, in one sense, this is good for the ACP because under the, well, it actually doesn't make any difference for ACP countries under EPAs because they get market access into the EU anyway. But in terms of going the other way around, yes, it's the basis of a negotiation if you want it to be, but you can also start from scratch.
I'll take a question from Razak and we put someone on Skype coming in now. Razak, just...
Yeah. Thank you. This was one of the points that I would like to make during my presentation. But since the discussion had taken place, I thought this is an ideal time for me to answer that question. What about the possibility with the UK providing duty-free quota-free market access or EPA kind of mechanism, everything but arms? I take Sheila's point. Okay, what UK is going to do is something to question mark. But having said that, there is a genuine possibility for UK to have that kind of arrangements on stage. And in my view, UK can do better than what is in there in EPA. So I welcome that point made by Lauren, but at the same time I think, potentially speaking, UK can make improvements. Why? Here is one clue. Think about the rules of origin under EPA, which is absolutely at times, it doesn't suit the need of the many of the agencies. And there were examples. Think about Australian and Canada type of rules of origin mechanism, and UK can easily copy it. And this is absolutely unilateral initiative that UK can undertake, can devise, and it start doing it right from now, so that within the next few years, when it's out of European Union, if it is going to be, then that mechanism there, and LDCs get a kind of more continued business environment. So that's one issue. with regards to EPA, I wouldn't make any comment on the carry from EPAs, just because Edwin and my previous boss and there are so many people on expertise on carry. But more fundamentally, carry from EPA is quite different from the ones that are being negotiated with the African countries and the Pacific countries. Because the EPAs in Africa, they only deal with goods. Right? They're goods. Now, what is in the interest of African countries, for example, like to negotiate something on good based on reciprocity? And that was one of the fundamental problems with the EPA negotiation in the first place. And particularly LDCs, they get EPA, everything but arms, while they have to offer reciprocity. That is a basic contradiction. I think going ahead, UK can do much better than this current European Union arrangements. I would suggest give EPA to all countries. We don't need to take anything back from the African countries. But at the same time, try to do something like AGUA type of mechanism. The US has an AGUA, where all sub-Saharan African countries, they are currently benefited from this mechanism, both LDCs and non-LDCs. And there is precedence in the WTO that can be partisan justified. I'm not a legal expert, but my view is UK is a country that has always fought for the development issues, and still is doing so. So for UK, it's very simple. It will save them from negotiating the EPA kind of completely, to some extent, many people argue, not very productive mechanism, but at the same time, do in line of something like AGUA style mechanism.
I think we'll have you advising Mr. Fox. I'll let Lauren come in very quickly and then pass on to answer these sort of questions, and we've got them.
I just want to add a legal dimension to this option. I think this makes a lot of sense to me. Just in terms of the law, the UK can give duty-free, quota-free to LDCs, as the EU and UK as part of the EU is doing at the moment. It's a little bit trickier with non-LDCs because they're all in the same basket. So the only reason that AGOA is able to discriminate between African developing countries, so non-LDC developing countries, and other developing countries is that there's a waiver. So that would be important. Otherwise, it can improve the GSP, but it would be GSP for all.
In fact, we've had Paul.
No, I'm just.
Okay, Ransom Smith and then just two speakers. Ransom?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yes, some of the questions I have addressed, I agree with Dr. Bartels regarding the UK inheriting the schedule of the EU. I think that is perhaps the most likely legal outcome, although being not a lawyer myself. The question of the EU and the GSP has been raised, and I intended also to comment that, in my view, those are unilateral commitments, and the UK will be free to decide on what it wishes to do in respect of those. The point just raised about the GSP, I think, is also an important one, that if the ACP countries seek to work GSP route and seek to significantly improve GSP, the UK will be constrained by the non-discriminatory generalized nature of the jobs that through a waiver route. And one final issue I wanted to comment on was actually the question of negotiating as soon as Article 50 is triggered. And again, I will leave the legal judgment up to Dr. Bartels and others. But it seems to me that as a practical matter, it might not be such an easy thing to do, because the UK will be uncertain about the outcome of its withdrawal, the terms of its outcome. Its negotiating partners will be uncertain about what the UK's ultimate status will be, and that fact will have an influence on what kind of trade negotiations you can.
I don't need to listen to the audio.
That will be a constraining factor that you have to be borne in mind. Things like rules of origin and all that are intimately linked to the ultimate status of the EU and of the UK and its ultimate relationship with the EU, and those won't be decided as soon as Article 50 is triggered. And that is the point I wanted to interject. Thank you very much.
Thanks. I'm very keen for us to move forward. We do have some questions coming from those both following this online. I will ask Josephine, was this on the same theme or? Yes. Yes, please, Josephine. Do come to this area. Please come to this area if you don't mind.
Hi, my name is Josephine Host, and I just wanted to respond to a point you made on the replication of the AGOA in the future Africa-UK trade arrangement. I think there's been a lot of problems with the AGOA, and digitalization being one of them, and also not everybody on Capitol agrees on whether the AGOA should continue. So to put Africa in a situation where you have a stop-start way of trading is very problematic, one, especially for investment. Why would I as an investor invest in any business that's targeting the American market and the AGOA if every 5 years we don't know if this preference is on or it isn't on? So I think what Africa needs is something that's sustainable, something that doesn't have this gloom and doom. Is it happening? Is it not happening? So I think going back, we need to look at what is happening on the ground, what's practical for Africa right now, and that should inform the way forward in terms of what kind of a trading arrangement we carve out with the United Kingdom. One of the problematic issues I experienced, I worked with a SADC EPA, technical working group in Brussels, was that there was a disconnect between government, negotiating on behalf of the African countries and the private sector. Whereas on the EU side, the private sector was very much involved. So what was coming to Brussels at the Commission level was actually information coming from the private sector, and that needs to happen at the African level. We need the private sector to tell us exactly what's going on, exactly what works for them, and that should form some kind of guidance for the way forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Although you are on an speaker, if it's absolutely right, 15 seconds and then all
I did not mean or I didn't say replicate our style. But I always believe you can make improvements for current existing analytics. Because in many of the preferential schemes, and in this in particular, there are professional human rights and many other things. But also like the point that you made about duration. There is that you can make improvements. The other point that you raised, which I find absolutely true, and there is going to be more generalized problem, like the integration between the negotiators and the prime minister. There is one more challenge for all giving countries, even those that are negotiating under the
Let me just respond very quickly to that. I think one of the problems with the AGOA that you mentioned was that it's uncertain because it's voluntary, it's unilateral. What I'd like to say about that, I've looked at this one quite closely. In my opinion, there's absolutely no reason why preferential arrangements like that cannot be bound under Article 2 of GATT. And in fact, in 1947, quite a few were. The idea that GSP has to remain unbound is simply wrong. And frankly, I said this at the time, one of the things that could have been said to the EU when the whole concept of this was still up in the air was that GSP could be bound.
We move from the realm of economics to realpolitik. Some of those ideas, of course, is always there, but there is a political decision. We have one question this has come through. So if this be read out.
So we have a question from Andrew Satney, and he asked, should ACP initiate discussions with Britain for a bilateral trade agreement, and should the CARICOM do the same?
Before the answer is now just take the last two interventions and we really must move on. Josephine, I feel you had to follow up on the question, and then Paul, and we have to wrap. Josephine?
The issue of accumulation those are included in AGOA and those are not included. So when we're looking at global value chains, for example, or regional value chains that feed into a global value chain, that is problematic. So anything AGOA-like may be problematic. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Yes, just a quick one last point. I mean, I can't imagine UK exports being happy if EU companies have trade preferences which they don't enjoy. If you look at what happened with the South Africa agreement, those that were outside the EU lost market share to those inside the EU in a number of commodities. So I think we need to make a distinction between the short-term transitional period post-Brexit and the long-term framework. I think if you think about the UK adopting a position which doesn't minimise the trade disruptions within the context of a joint commitment to, on the side of both parties, ACP parties and the UK, to try and minimise trade disruptions with a view to negotiating as expeditiously as possible a reciprocal agreement. But in the short term, finding a mechanism whereby the current preferences which countries have enjoyed since 2008 are sustained. And the question is, if that was done on clearly a transitional basis, is that likely to be challenged in the WTO?
Good. So, I invite Laurent, if he wishes to respond to all of those questions. Also, there were other speakers as well, so if they need which to like they did.
Well, the question that came from the internet, I know there's a person behind it, I'm afraid I don't know who it is.
Andrew Sutton.
Ah, right, okay, well, thank you. Yes, definitely. As I said, I think negotiations should start now, well, as soon as possible, because in fact I think 2 years, given what has happened with the EPAs recently, in that sense you could use it as a template and save a lot of time. But of course there's more that can be done, I would imagine. But I think, yeah, I would start the car rolling at the moment. In terms of a transitional arrangement and whether that's likely to be challenged, well, I think we've seen that before. We've seen that with the Cotonou waiver, which is, and the question would be, is something like that likely to be obtained? And if it's not obtained, would anybody make much of a fuss about it? And I think that probably depends very much on which ACP grouping you're talking about. Just as we saw before, there seems to be a little bit more going on with the Caribbean that way than with Africa. I mean, let's face it, the EU's unilateral preference scheme for the EPA wannabes is also quite flatly illegal and has been illegal since the 31st of December 2007, but nobody cares. You know? So I think it depends very much on who you're talking about.
We now move to the next section. I will not attempt to summarize at all. We've got two brilliant economists who are going to be discussing this question from a technical standpoint. We've looked at the structural and the legal side of things. Now it is a hard trade, the actual flows of goods and services, etc. The first speaker will be Dr. Mohammad Razak of the Commonwealth Secretariat. And I would be invited, particularly since he is already, I'd given him 4 minutes. He's used up 2 already. But he's worried. No, I'll give you have 3 minutes.
Thank you, moderator. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I think one of the points I've already elaborated, but given the fact that the discussion have already gone into that place, I would like to make one final comment on that one. With regards to EPAs, again in the context of Africa, one of the prominent argument was in favor of EPA that it will promote African integration. But in the process, many people think that that has resulted in more fragmentation within Africa. So here is a kind of mechanism. Again, it's a possibility. And when I say this, please consider it as my personal view or from the kind of expertise that
I have along with my team here from the Government Secretariat. The solution could be something like this. Think about doing EPAs and something like a preferential mechanism for all other African countries. And since that mechanism has been on under AGOA for a certain time, we believe getting a waiver should not be a problem. Now, like any kind of unilateral preferential mechanism, that is absolutely at the discretion of the donor countries. Having said that, fully agree with Lauren that that can be also be multilateralized, but given, the duty-free quota-free market access, even for the LDCs in the WTO, that hasn't happened, but that is possible. Here is the perhaps one possible solution if you want to promote African integration as well. So start with a more better AGOA kind of style for the whole African continent, and then wait for the period when African countries, they are going to have their Africa-wide continental customs union or FTA, and that is on there, the plan. The plan is to have something like by 2019. So in the meantime, the UK could institute something, a unilateral preferential mechanism, and then wait for that to happen, and then have a FTA with the continent-wide Africa. That solves the problem, at least if you want to promote African integration. So that's the first part. Now let me just take you through some of the general points that I wanted to share with you. We're discussing here of Commonwealth developing countries and UK. And there is one line summary just to give us a more kind of, I would say, comprehensive perspective. UK's imports from the Commonwealth developing countries currently is about $32 billion. Okay, so that's the trade in goods only. That is the import that is coming from other Commonwealth developing countries. Then, if you think about the remittances, how much remittances are going from UK to all other Commonwealth developing countries, that figure is close to $12 billion. If you think about how much ODA UK is providing to Commonwealth developing countries, that figure is $3.5 billion. Now, in terms of the transmission of the effects that we are seeing in the post-Brexit regime, and according to our some preliminary calculation, if you think this depreciation of the currency pound sterling is going to be sustained at a rate of 10%, then all Commonwealth developing countries will have seen purchasing power of their remittances, exports, and ODA falling by $4 billion within the next year or so, roughly, under some certain assumptions. So that's one. Fundamentally, though, you think about the general trade and development aspects under the WTO, that is something needs to be taken into consideration. Last year, the global community adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, and unlike the Millennium Development Goals, we have seen a lot of emphasis has been given on trade in achieving or in materializing those goals. And now we're living in a global world where we have seen for the past 5 consecutive years since 2011, global trade growth rate has been just about 3%. What is the long run global trade growth rate? It's more than 6%. So we are already in such a situation where trade is subdued, and even the current forecast that we are seeing getting from the IMF and the World Bank, that is not going to recover pretty soon. So one question is, how then we are going to take forward the whole agenda of sustainable development. And this is where I find the role of UK is going to be extremely important, because this is one of the developed countries that is committed to promoting these goals, and including the 0.7% of ODA is they're currently providing with regards to their GDP. Now, since UK is going to be, I believe, outside the European Union, a firm member of the WTO, as Lauren had pointed out, so that means we might be able to say, at least I hope to say, there is going to be a more vibrant movement on the WTO side to revive the trade multilateralism. From the Commonwealth Secretariat, and I believe many of us here, we have always argued that we need trade multilateralism to protect our small states and LDC members and sub-Saharan African countries better. And I think that could also be an opportunity. We know we have got all the challenges, but what I'm talking about here, more kind of opportunities. And UK is getting back to the WTO as a country outside the European Union. I believe that could be a significant boost to that initiative. Edwin, perhaps I have already taken longer than this. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Razak. No, I mean, you've been good. We now have. He's not spoken as yet in this session, but I have met him on previous occasions, and he's Dr. Maximiliano Mendez Parra, who is an economist, trade economist with the Overseas Development Institute. Very, very knowledgeable, and he understands he understands the issues of preferences and preference erosion and the implications of this, which of course are really key in this case. So, could I invite you to address us? You, like Razak, you will not be too long.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Yes, I would like to talk of something that has been a bit overlooked, but is key when we think in terms of preferences. We have been discussing about the possibility of continuation of EBA, etc. But I think there is something key here that are the preference margins. And that depends on the most favorable nation tariff that the UK will define when leave the EU. And this is something that the UK will have to decide. Outside the EU, the UK will be autonomous and will need to define what is compliant to the schedule, whatever it is. It will have to be a new most favorable nation tariff. And that depends a lot on the type of agreement that the UK will reach with the EU. Basically because the EU is by large the most important trading partner. Among all the scenarios that have been discussed, I mean the European Economic Area, the Swiss, the Canadian, etc., there is just one where actually will have minimum implications for developing countries. That is, if the UK decides to, or negotiates, not decides, I mean, probably it's better to talk about negotiates. I think there is a lot of decision of making FTAs without considering that the other part also will want to make an FTA or not. We need to negotiate a customs union with the EU, sort of agreement that the EU currently has with Turkey. In that case, MFN tariffs will remain unchanged. Preferential arrangements will also remain unchanged. So the disruption in terms of market access for developing countries will be minimal. In the other scenarios, the UK will have to define a new MFN tariff. There is a possibility that the UK decides to set its MFN tariff at a very similar level that currently is with the EU. I mean, it's a possibility, and probably that will reduce the problem. But there have been some voices before, actually, to have a very low MFN tariff. I mean, there was a possibility of having even zero tariff. And that would mean, for example, like a country for Bangladesh, that exports 50% of the export to the EU, 10% of its exports go to the UK, is that preference margin that will go from 12% now, that is the MFN of the EU, that is 12%, 0 to 0. That would be a very important shock for products where the profit margins are very low, such as textiles, where basically a 1 point, 2 points of preference margin make a huge difference. So actually, this is another dimension, another thing to think about at the time of evaluating the effects of Brexit in developing countries. The other issue that was mentioned is the issue of standards. Nowadays, any developing country that exports to the EU and exports to the UK faces the same type of standard. Not only faces the same standard, they have to be certified once for meeting that standard. In a very extreme scenario, I personally believe that the standards of the UK will not be substantially different from those of the EU, even in the most extreme scenario, because clearly the UK wants to keep similar standards to the EU. There is an issue that countries will also need to certify the compliance of those standards probably twice. So I think it would be very important also whatever can reach the EU and the UK in terms of mutual recognitions of compliance of standards. That will also be key for developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It does not seem that there is a pressing. Yes, we take a couple of questions.
Yeah, Patrick Smith from Africa Confidential. It's just really a very small point. You mentioned about the customs union. What about if the UK stays in the single market and gets the Norwegian deal? Does that disrupt tariffs or not?
In the case of the Norwegian model, this is the European Economic Area. Clearly, you stay in the regional market, but Norway has its own MFN tariff. It doesn't have a customs union with the EU. So, in that scenario, that is a scenario that any talk, the UK would also have to define a new MFN tariff.
But it could equally just inherit the current EU relations.
Well, it could eventually thinking of a Norwegian plus customs union scenario. I don't know how politically easy that would be to sell at home here, but I think that the distinction is basically a customs union or a non-customs union. That is probably the.
Thanks. Next, we've got Dr. Brendan Vickers of.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Brendan Vickers of the Commonwealth Secretariat.
I was just intrigued about the customs union option, because how politically feasible would that be for the UK or economically? Because my understanding is if it's like a Turkey option, that means the countries that are FTA partners for the EU would have market access into the UK as they do to Turkey, but Turkey doesn't have the reciprocal market access back. So thinking that the EU has the deepest and widest network of FTAs globally, politically and economically, is that a feasible option?
Yes, yes. I think it's a very good question. I think that probably from the political point of view, it will be a very hard option to sell, because, as you said clearly, any country that signs an FTA with the EU will automatically have access to the UK, as currently is the case of Turkey. So I think that clearly is a very complicated solution. It's a very hard solution to sell. There could be a possibility of a different sort of customs union, where you think in terms of other type of customs union where that actually happen, but that would require some sort of recognition from the EU that the UK will have a voice in any agreement that the EU will sign. Then we can discuss if that is also politically feasible or not.
Thanks. Another question from Paul?
On the question of standards, I mean, there are agreements where the EU has mutual recognition with other countries, but that then doesn't apply to third parties. It's explicitly ruled out. So, for example, on organic standards, the US and the EU might recognise each other's organic standards, but they won't recognise US recognition of Caribbean organic standards in trade with the EU. So I think that there's a question of whether mutual recognition between the EU and the UK would lead to easier situation for ACP on the standard side.
Although, of course, mutual recognition opens its own new kind of worms. But I know that Laurent would want to take up some.
Thanks, Paul, for allowing me to get on my hobby horse here. Probably created a few heart attacks already. Let me create a few more. In my opinion, mutual recognition agreements of any kind, whether they are outside, in fact, especially if they are outside the framework of a free trade agreement or customs union, but even if they are within that framework, have to be extended to third countries on a non-discriminatory basis. That's obvious in the case of MRAs that don't have the cover of an FTA. You're just discriminating. No, there's no justification for this. If they are within the context of an FTA, according to the appellate body in Turkey Textiles, any discrimination that an FTA gives cover for has to be necessary, and of course mutual recognition is not necessary. I'm sorry, David, I'm particularly going to give you a heart attack because I also think that Cassis de Dijon is illegal.
Well, David will certainly have the opportunity to come back, because I think we could now invite David to, as we move from the general now to the specific, because trade is not just about general rules and the general framework, etc. It is about the actual movement of goods and the actual conduct of services. So we have to move from the macro to the micro, which is where business really takes place. Now, David has the good fortune of understanding one of the most important commodities in trade between the UK and the ACP countries, and that is sugar. David began his career in the math, I think, and in those days there was a sugar arrangement, and he went to when the EU took over sugar. David, for his sins, used to manage that. He will also be talking about later on. I know he will come back on another commodity that he is very much involved with. But first, we'll invite David to speak about sugar and his perspectives. David Roberts, former Deputy Director General of the EU Commission.
Thank you. And I should be a bit careful what I say, because the first time I ever had anything to do with sugar was 1970, and I was then the UK spokesman in the International Sugar Agreement, and I reached an agreement which didn't suit Tate and Lyle. 6 weeks later, I was posted to Denmark. Well, the UK is the biggest import market for cane sugar in the EU, so if the UK is not a member of the EU and therefore not a member of the EPAs, this is obviously a matter of concern for the ACP. But you can only die once. With the ending of the EU sugar quotas next year, the EU market will anyway become very much less attractive to ACP suppliers, because all the econometric analysis that has been done on that change, which takes place next October next year, will drive the EU market price down close to the world price. Personally, I think it could actually go below the world price. And that obviously would make the EU market very unattractive for ACP suppliers anyway. So we could turn the question round. Does Brexit offer a solution to this challenge? Could the ACP and the UK forge an agreement like the old Commonwealth Sugar Agreement to guarantee them a share of the UK market? Well, it's a beguiling idea. I don't know whether it's commercial. Although the rules of the GATT haven't actually changed since the 1970s, they're much more effectively enforced these days, and there's no ambiguity, as there was back then, as to whether they apply to agriculture. To rewrite the Commonwealth Sugar Agreement into WTO-compatible terms would require the UK to give duty-free access to ACP suppliers as a group, or, as in the Commonwealth Sugar Agreement, individually, whilst applying a tariff to MFN suppliers, including the EU. Now, we know from bananas, my other favourite subject, that if you wanted to do that, you would need two waivers. One, to allow you to discriminate in terms of your tariff treatment, and second, Article 13 waiver, to allow you to apply the tariff quota in a discriminatory way. Well, one waiver is hard enough when you're trying to negotiate your tariff schedule. Unless Lawrence is right, and that's going to be dead easy. Two waivers, very difficult. So I don't think that is going to be at all easy. The other thing is that the UK would have to do, if it wanted to mimic the Commonwealth Sugar Agreement, would be to limit its own sugar production, which again is not flavour of the month. In fact, the government, or is it the old government, I'm not sure, was a strong supporter of getting rid of EU sugar quotas, so it would be a bit of a volte-face to start to include it and apply them to its own producers. Now, you don't have to go quite that far. You could do something a bit less effective and slightly easier. That would be to negotiate with the ACP either as a group or individually, as in or in groups within the ACP, or even individually, as you have in some of the EPAs, a series of WTO-compatible FTAs,
within which ACP sugar could enter the UK duty-free, whilst the UK applied a tariff to MFN suppliers, including the EU. But the UK says that it wants to make free trade agreements. When I say the UK, I really mean the triumvirate of Brexiters, who are now in charge of UK trade policy, say that they want to make free trade agreements with fast-growing economies around the world. Just to think of a few of them, well, Brazil is usually cited, though actually they're not fast-growing at the moment. Australia, not growing all that fast, but better than some, and Thailand are all major sugar exporters. They're not going to negotiate free trade agreements with the UK, which exclude sugar. Even India, another target, which is sometimes a big exporter and sometimes an importer, would insist on a concession on sugar. So I can't see that the idea of having tariffs against all suppliers other than the ACP would run. And if you have free trade agreements with competitive sugar suppliers, the ACP will be in a difficult position. Of course, you might say, well, okay, that's the situation in the long term. FTAs take years and years to negotiate. Could that work in the short term? Well, the short term is the period when all FTAs will be up to negotiation, including the ones that form part of the EPAs. So you might reach the finishing post at the same time. So in short, I'm rather gloomy about the prospects of the ACP after the end of the sugar quota regime. I looked with some optimism at the idea that maybe Brexit could be, at least here, an opportunity, not an additional problem. But the more I looked at it, the less optimistic I became.
Well, if there's no future for sugar, then I think David probably might be called across to help the trade negotiators of the UK. We move to another also very troublesome commodity, which David is also expert on. But we'll be having someone else to introduce it. He's Mr. Alistair Smith, who has spent a very long time working on bananas. Although his area has been very much in Latin America, he's also worked with Caribbean farmers. And he will be speaking to us from France, where I think he considers himself to be at risk of being probably one of these refugees if in the post-Brexit era. So are you here, Alistair? Yes. Although we can't see you, though, I haven't seen you for many years, so I'm not sure what you look like.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me well?
Yes, very well.
Okay. I'll just make a short introduction. One to situate where the UK banana market is now, and secondly to make some suggestions as to maybe what the UK could do that is more interesting than what the EU currently does for bananas. Bearing in mind this has been, as you know, the EU banana regime was for 15 years a very big headache. But I'm not going to go into that. Where is the UK today? Imports have more than tripled since the days when the Windward Islands and Jamaica accounted for nearly 70% of the UK's consumption. That was back 25 years ago. So imports are now over 1 million tonnes a year and rival Germany in terms of the volume. Percent of ACP bananas, but a very large proportion of them are not from the Windward Islands anymore, but are from the Dominican Republic.
which is the big beneficiary of duty-free quota access to the EU, particularly to the UK. Currently there's a tariff of 117 euros a tonne that's going down towards 75 by 2020. That's paid by MFN countries, that's to say in this case Latin America. And there are no longer any quota or volume restrictions. There is just a safeguard clause which gives quite a high maximum volume for Latin American bananas, and is mainly in the name of the protection of the EU's own bananas, and hasn't been invoked. So a tariff which is going down by 2020 towards 75 euros a tonne. And the last bit of important current information is that the UK, of course, contributes to the banana accompanying measures, which were negotiated after the end of the WTO dispute, which are for Caribbean and African countries, and those programs will come to an end by 2019-2020. Those are, of course, EU programs. So what could the UK do that's more interesting than the EU? Well, maybe, and I throw out some ideas that are deliberately provocative, maybe for small-scale Caribbean farmers, the UK could offer a quota preference, and maybe even support for organic conversion, because that's where the market's going. Fair trade and organic is where the world market is going in no uncertain terms, led by the UK, I should say. And maybe for small Caribbean farmers, and this is beyond government issues, but maybe retailers should be asked to prioritise fair trade and fair trade organic from ACP countries. Already an important market in the UK, but retailers could play a role, not just government. But on the trade policy level, how about to rebalance the unfair competition which still exists between Latin American bananas with very high social and environmental costs and Caribbean and African bananas? How about doing something which we were told we could never do because of Article 1 or 2 of the Maastricht Treaty, and that is to recycle tariffs. If the UK is receiving £75 million a year in tariffs from bananas, assuming it replicates the current tariff level by 2020, then why couldn't it recycle a proportion of that or all of that into making the banana industry in Latin America more sustainable and therefore fairer competition by supporting social and environmental improvements? So the UK on its own would be in a much easier position vis-a-vis tariff recycling. The Maastricht Treaty disallows it in the EU law, but why should it be impossible in the UK in the future? And another government piece of policy, given the horrendous price wars over bananas in the UK market, shouldn't the UK be looking at a law to prevent below-cost selling? And a last, much more probably pragmatic short-term idea is one advantage of being outside the EU statistics gathering process could be that the UK could gather much better, much more useful statistics on organic and fair trade and certified imports. Somebody raised the question of standards and certification, and of course it wouldn't make much sense for a company like Lidl operating in Germany and the UK, as it does, selling privately labelled bananas if that company had to pay for certification twice. You can be sure they'll be pressing for some kind of harmonisation in certified standards, private and public. Just to finish, the worst case scenario, of course, of Brexit is that the British government chooses to reduce the MFN tariffs on bananas without any social environmental conditionality at all. That's the disaster scenario, and that's presumably what everybody has a common interest in lobbying to prevent, to avert. Thanks. I hope that's provoked some thoughts. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much, Alistair. We've got a question that came online. I would like that question, if it could be read out, and the to whoever it was addressed will answer it in due course. We will now, just right after the question, we will be looking at other products that are exported. We'd be having Dr. Paul Goodison, who is senior advisor to the Ramphal Institute, will be looking at a whole category of products, which would be floricultural, horticultural, and other commodities. He is also an expert on beef and veal, which is of interest to the countries particularly of the Southern African region. So he will be actually making 2 presentations. So I will, as soon as the question is read out, I'll ask him to come up. So please, let's get the question.
So it's a comment and a question. It's from Ransford Smith. He says, I agree with Dr. Bartels on the UK inheriting the EU schedule. The GSP and EPA being not scheduled but unilateral commitments will be up to the EU to decide on. Also, whatever the legality of entering trade negotiations as soon as Article 50 is triggered, this might pose practical difficulties as those engaging in negotiations with the UK and even the UK itself will be uncertain about the UK's ultimate status. The above should be up to the UK to decide on, not the EU. And if the UK has to define a new MFN tariff, we should not underestimate how much this complicates the picture. The UK will have to negotiate with all WTO parties, and this process could, as we have seen in other cases, take many years. And that's it.
We will, of course, give Laurent an opportunity to answer this, but Paul, if what I would suggest you do is you do them one after the other without an interruption. But that doesn't mean you spend twice as long.
Okay. It's great to be here with everybody today. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I'll start with beef and veal, if I may. Something that strikes me is that actually during the transition, prior to leaving the EU, I think you'll probably find that EU livestock exporters go on a major export drive just in case they make a mess of their dealings with the EU. And I think we need to be aware of this, particularly as you move towards implementing the reciprocal commitments under the EPAs. Particularly those relating to the elimination of non-tariff measures, because it will put you on the horns of the dilemma as to what you do 2 or 3 years down the line when the UK is no longer eligible. Point being that the EU currently exports 18% of its beef production, 92.5% of that going to the EU. So hence their desire to look for alternative markets just in case. They're looking to target quality differentiated markets for increasingly quality labelled beef exports, which is not necessarily a major issue for ACP countries. It is an issue in certain markets which are being targeted by ACP quality beef exporters, or they plan to target in the coming years, so it will have knock-on effects. What's also likely to happen is they'll be under pressure to maximise their revenues from 5th quarter exports of beef and low quality cuts. And these UK exporters are likely to target markets in West Africa, which could have some implications for the functioning of local meat markets and the functioning of regional trade relationships in meat products. So that's kind of the immediate transitional issue. The other transitional issue is the impact of devaluation on the value of the UK market relative to the Norwegian, Swiss and EU markets for existing ACP beef exporters. That will probably change somewhat. And for those ACP beef exporters, there is quite a problem in that they are heavily dependent on the UK market in terms of their exports to Europe. So 65% of Namibia's fresh and chilled beef exports to Europe come to the UK market, and for Botswana it's 53%. Namibia has a lower dependence on the UK market for frozen beef, and Botswana higher, on about 75% of their exports. So for those particular sectors, if they no longer enjoy the preferences which they currently enjoy, it will be highly problematical because they will effectively be excluded from the market if they lose those duty-free, quota-free access to the UK market. So for the individual sectors it's quite a big issue. The point is that in terms of volumes, it's a relatively small volumes. And in that context, I actually think the Namibians are in a better position to redirect their exports to other EU markets because they have a clear branding strategy, quality differentiating strategy, and it's just a question of probably recruiting a couple more staff and gaining and working on finding other markets in Europe to gradually move tonnages out of the UK market to the EU market in the coming couple of years. Botswana's in a slightly worse position because they're not so far advanced on the issue of clear branding and quality differentiation. So the point I'm trying to make here in the beef and veal sector is that for individual countries there are particular sectors where there can be problems, but those problems can be manageable because we're not talking huge volumes in terms of the overall size of the EU market. Although bearing in mind the market for quality differentiated meat is much smaller than the overall EU market. But it should be quite manageable if the proper assistance is put in early through the right channels. So for example in the case of Namibia helping MECO to just up its work on mainland Europe. A more fundamental issue I think on the trade in beef is SPS and food safety certification issues. A vacuum cannot be allowed to emerge with regard to these issues. And one hopes that the UK government will simply accept the acquis of accumulated EU regulations in this area and apply them to imports from ACP countries. But if things do begin to go pear-shaped in the EU, UK negotiations, that might be left up in the air. And it's a need therefore to keep a close eye on how that UK-EU process develops so that you can respond appropriately. I think, generally speaking, this SPS issue and food safety certification issue and recognition of the existing EU systems is quite important because I'm not sure, and David can probably tell me, and all other people in this room, how well equipped the UK is bilaterally to begin the kind of food and veterinary office inspections and certification processes bilaterally outside of an EU framework if they should have to go down that path. So that's basically beef and veal. In the horticulture sector, some ACP countries have a very high dependence on the UK market. For example, in the vegetable exports from Kenya, you're talking for different categories of products between 50 and 85% of their exports to the EU coming into the UK market. So any loss of DFQS access to the UK market would seriously reduce the profitability of these exports and would require significant adjustments, particularly if, as Lauren has implied, the UK inherits the EBA obligations of the EU, because that would then make neighbouring countries to Kenya more attractive locations for investment in these kind of horticulture supply chains in Kenya itself. In the horticulture sector, this appears to be a more important issue for Anglophone ACP countries than for Francophone ACP countries. They don't have such a high dependence on the UK market, as you would expect. A similar situation exists with regard to the fruit sector, particularly in southern Africa, with an important dependence on the UK market, but a declining dependence on the UK market as they opened up markets for their fruit exports in other regions of the world. That being stated, the fruit and vegetable sector is actually a kind of sensitive sector for the UK because such a high volume of consumption is imported. either from the EU or from the rest of the world. So you can actually see a strong imperative to try and make sure there's no serious disruption of this trade in fruit and vegetables, given almost 2/3 of the UK consumption is imported. A lot depends on how the UK-EU negotiations go. If they go badly, given that around 38% of UK fruit and vegetable consumption comes from the EU sources, if they go badly, it could conceivably create new opportunities for ACP exporters and other third country exporters. Given that the UK is highly dependent on imports in the fruit and vegetable sector, we don't need to take a kind of ACP begging bowl approach to the UK on these issues. We should be looking at African, Southern African, East African countries working jointly with the UK to try and minimise disruption in the fruit and vegetable trade, given that the UK requires such high levels of fruit and vegetable imports. So I think that's quite an important selling point, to make it clear there's actually a mutual interest here in finding new arrangements quickly established to ensure that long-term supplies to the UK fruit and vegetable sector are secure. This could be a useful bargaining tool or negotiating point when trying to get some kind of transitional arrangement while long-term reciprocal free trade arrangements are negotiated. But, of course, if things go pear-shaped in the UK's negotiations with the EU, then the danger is that the UK could go to a far more liberal trade regime for fruit and vegetables, which would erode the margins of preference which ACP fruit and vegetable exporters have enjoyed, and which have been such a key factor in impact. We need to keep a close eye on the developments in the coming 2 years to see which way it's going to go in the fruit and vegetable sector, have fallback options and readjust your strategy in the light of how that core EU-UK relationship evolves. Again, the issue of SPS food safety certification comes up. We can't afford for there to be a kind of suspended animation in terms of the regulatory regime for SPS and food safety certification. The UK goes down the path of accepting the EU acquis or unweaving UK and EU food safety and SPS regulations, so whether they go down a kind of scrap the lot and start from scratch approach, that will have a crucial impact on ACP ability to access the UK market. On the floriculture side, ironically, Kenya is not as dependent on the UK market as it is in its vegetable exports. It still tends to go through the Dutch auction houses, but they do tend to export higher value pre-packaged, barcoded bouquets to the UK market, because we're not a very romantic bunch, we Englishmen, and we tend to just buy flowers on the checkout at Sainsbury's rather than going to the trouble of making it a statement of loan. So it's a different pattern of consumption is the point that I'm making here. The point is that if things go a bit pear-shaped in the EU-UK relationship, some of the sourcing through the Dutch auction houses may change and move over to more direct sourcing in due course, which could create new opportunities for some producers in Africa to move up the value chain. Thank you, Edwin. The citrus sector is one area where the SPS issues could be a win through Brexit. We've had this situation where the Spanish have pushed for more stringent citrus black spot controls on citrus exports, which have required major investment costs in South Africa and which have squeezed 75% of Swazi citrus exports out of the EU market. Post-Brexit, there need not be any reason why the UK should have such strict standards which the Spanish have insisted upon. And this could open up new opportunities for small-scale producers, organic growers in South Africa, and could allow Swaziland to re-establish its citrus export volumes and even expand them, specifically targeting the UK market, which has lower requirements in terms of citrus black spot controls than the mainland EU market, which has largely been driven by the interests of Spanish producers. Wider wins on this SPS issue and how you deal with SPS issues. I think there's a lot of ways in where the UK could go further and do better than the EU in this area, in the horticulture, floriculture sector. And that could be one of the kind of plus areas in any future negotiations. But it would mean that you would have to identify what those individual wins are very specifically. And this could deal with things like risk assessment and the basis of risk assessment, how many consignments need to come in before you can have a risk assessment, how frequently inspections have to take place, the fees applied, etc., all those kind of issues. Point being that we could start looking towards a kind of status quo plus arrangement, i.e. preserving what ACP countries have under the EPAs, the interim EPA arrangement, but something additional with the UK. And I think SPS issues in sectors like horticulture could be an important area where we have those plus arrangements which bring more benefits. Just to summarise, I think we need to, in the beef sector and the horticulture sector, we need to plan for different contingencies, different courses of development within that core UK-EU relationship. We need to closely monitor those developments, and as several people have already stressed, we need to go proactive during the transition so that ACP concerns are addressed early on and not submerged in the enormous workload which is going to confront UK officials as the deadline for Brexit approaches closer and closer. Thank you, everyone, for your tolerance.
Thank you very much, Paul. Could I just take a couple of questions and then we'll move on to the next. First, Laurent.
Sorry for taking the lectern again, but I just wanted to also for what's coming next, I think Junior Lodge is speaking next, just make a few of legal points concerning what's just been said. I might start with SPS. Now, my view is that when Brexit happens, as far as UK law is concerned, what was nominally EU law will not simply disappear. That would leave a huge gap in the UK legal system. So SPS measures can change after that, but I imagine that on day one they'll probably be exactly the same. If anything, they will get better, they'll get more relaxed, because you need to justify an SPS measure on the basis of science. It's not something to be negotiated in principle. I know that sometimes it is, but it's not supposed to be. It's supposed to be scientific. So if the UK can't justify on a scientific basis why it has SPS measures, and this may be different from, an EU-wide measure because it has to cover so many different territories, then it simply can't have the SPS measure. So that actually seems to me that, if anything, the situation is going to get much better. In terms of the overall idea of, say, tariffs and MFN tariffs and so on, I don't think it's I think it's a little bit could be misleading to talk about defining an MFN tariff. That isn't what happens. What happens is you've got a maximum tariff that you can have, which is the bound tariff, and under that you can choose a tariff. But there it seems to me that the only disruption is good disruption, because, with one exception, you get to export under a lower tariff. The problem, as we heard earlier from Maximiliano, is that you then have preference erosion, right? That is clearly the problem, right? But the idea that somehow it's a unilateral matter for you to define in the sense that it might go upwards, I think is not quite right. One final point which Paul made, I just want to emphasize, I think it applies more generally. ACP countries are actually going to be in a better situation under the EPAs following Brexit in one respect, which is they were negotiated on the basis that the UK would suck up the exports, and I suppose you have duty-free access, but it's certainly not going to be in any worse situation. And for that matter, other countries, and this is relevant for ACP countries exporting to other countries as well, and in terms of competition in the EU market, they are also going to be in a better situation post-Brexit.
Canada, for instance, if that agreement actually gets applied, all Canadian exports that were going to be dumped on the UK, they can now be dumped on the EU. So, in that sense, the ACP needs to watch out to see what's happening with third country FTAs with the EU as well.
Thank you very much, Laurent, and sorry for pressing, but suddenly realized that, when you're having fun, time seems to fly, and we're very rapidly running out of time. We've got Junior Lodge, who is in Brussels. He's the team leader of what's called the Trade Technical Barriers to Trade program, an ACP EU program. He's speaking not so much because of his position, but he's just concluding a major research exercise on the impact on manufactured goods. So which is why he is here. I would now, since given that we just have a few minutes left, I would be urging the next speakers to just cut by 50% whatever you've got to say, and we will have the entire presentations on the website. So, Junior, you've got the floor. Junior Lodge, I know that you're there.
Yeah, sure. I was just trying to mute my my mic. Can you hear me? All right. Thank you very much. I almost said Ramphal. Sorry. Thank you very much, Edwin. Really appreciate it. Just briefly, I was asked to deal with manufacturing, and obviously I tried to use the NAMA approach of looking at fish and chemicals, machinery, plastics, textiles, footwear, etc. And when you're talking about fish, there is the UK, like the EU, is currently a part of the EU, but like most industrialized countries, they tend to apply tariff escalation with respect to the treatment of fish products. So you have a 4% ad valorem equivalent on live fish, but you have 20% on processed tuna fish, and therefore the ACP countries benefit considerably from a preference margin on fish. And I imagine, I think this has been said often, that in terms of moving forward, it is unlikely that the UK is going to radically overhaul it's not only its WTO tariff schedule, which is bound, but also its applied rates. In fact, to the contrary, one could argue that the UK, having regained its sovereignty with respect to trade policy, might revert to the country that we have always known, which is very liberal in terms of trade policy. So that is in terms of fish. But obviously, there are many unknowns. So, for example, what will be the UK fisheries policy? What will be the quotas that will be applied? What will be will it be pursuing a fisheries partnerships agreement? And if so, what are the rules of origin? What is going to be the subsidy arrangements? What are going to be the food safety arrangements? So we are in the realm of a number of unknown with respect to fish, but it is the same theme with respect to manufactured goods in the more classic case. Someone had mentioned rules of origin. Will there be the drift towards, will there be the retention of the EU approach, which is more product-specific rules of origin, or will there be a kind of pinching of the Anglo-Saxon or perhaps US approach, which is more in terms of a simple value added, which you see in AGOA? Compliance costs. You're seeing, for example, possibly two different rules of origin arrangements, and the additional costs in terms of complying with two different rules of origin regime can be between 4 and 15%. And in a context of small economies, such as most of the ACP countries are, that can be rather considerable with respect to trade competitiveness. But the standards, there are two types of standards. One is, strictly speaking, technical regulations, which are mandatory, but the bulk of standards are actually voluntary standards. And whereas 75% in the EU are voluntary standards, in the case of the UK, it is even higher. So again, there is this question of what will emerge with respect to the treatment of standards. I heard Laurent speaking about MRAs having to be applied on an FTA basis. But even if that were the case, one needs to recognize that in the case of ACP countries, you're talking about very, very limited institutional and regulatory capacity to apply MRAs. The institutional capability is rather weak. Just quickly, I feel that when you're talking about manufacturing, you have to look at a whole host of instruments. It's not enough just to look at, let's say, the narrow cluster of trade or the traditional trade issues in terms of, let's say, tariffs. But for example, what are the trade contingency measures? The EU, for example, has generally been rather relaxed about safeguards. It is not that strong, but certainly in terms of anti-dumping measures, it has been quite active. It has opened 63 anti-dumping investigations since 2012. A lot of them, of course, has been directed at China. But again, here is the unknown. You don't know how the UK will behave with respect to trade contingency measures. We haven't seen, certainly not in recent times, its own independent pursuits in that area. What will be the UK's notification under the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures? What will be the height, of its subsidies? And obviously, of course, there's a dimension under the agreement on agriculture, but I'm just limiting myself to manufacturing. Again, the big unknown. Competition policy. Although there's an EU-wide competition regime, the UK has tended to apply a different interpretation of competition policy. So, for example, under the EU, it tends to be an ex-ante mandatory notification. In the case of the UK, this is voluntary. So, again, how will that play out with respect to the market access conditions for the UK? I think at the last meeting, Ramphal Institute meeting. Okay, so I'm just seeing that I have to wrap up. One issue which I think is key, and I'll just throw this out for some kind of provocation, which is that it's the issue of compensation. My understanding is that when Greenland exited the EU in 1983, there was indeed a discussion within the Commission on compensation, whether the shrinking of the EU market access space warranted the offer of compensation to third countries, such as those in the ACP that have negotiated on good faith, let's say EPAs as such. Is there any kind of legal basis? And this is a question perhaps for Laurent. And my final point is that I support very much the pitch that has been made, which is for us to be proactive. And one element of being proactive is also having giving due recognition to the UK for what it has done with respect to trade capacity building. It has been a leader, in some instances not exactly supportive. So for example, this business of graduation is a UK initiative, and we in the Caribbean are going to be exposed to it under the 11th EDF. But in a number of areas with respect to whether it is the TAF, whether it is Card Fund, whether it is the trademarks program, the UK has been an innovator. And so moving forward, to what extent can those good practices not only be retained and developed further within the UK, but also that the EU can borrow some of these good practices with respect to how trade capacity building measures are implemented. With that, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Junior. So far we've been discussing trade in goods, trade in services, which are, of course, of tremendous importance. We've left for last, because we know that you're all interested in trade in goods, in services, so you wouldn't leave before we got to that. And we've got the expert who has been working on EPA services for several of the regions. Jodie Keane, Dr. Jodie Keane of the Commonwealth Secretariat, the policy division.
For the floor. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to be with you here today, and I'll try and be brief as we're running over time, and probably just to let you know that I am speaking in my personal capacity as well. So in terms of EPAs and Brexit and the implications for services, I think we have to recognise that services are obviously a major offensive interest for the UK, but they're also a major offensive interest for the ACP and for the Caribbean in particular. And the Caribbean region, as we know, is the only EPA which is comprehensive, which covers both goods and services. So it's a major offensive interest. It's a really important sector, both for the UK and for the CARIFORUM. And what I want to get across to you today is that when thinking about the effect of Brexit on services, we have to think about the Brexit shock, which is currently ongoing. So just last week, I was in Trinidad and Tobago, and I felt the effect as a tourist in that region of Brexit on me, because my holiday was more expensive. So this Brexit shock already has implications for the services sector and for the tourism sector in particular, and therefore for the CARIFORUM region. And I think this deserves more attention, because many countries in the region already have balance of payment difficulties, limited reserves, and there are we know that there are inadequate shock facilities. So I would like to draw your attention to that issue right now. On the other hand, UK exports to the region, to the CARIFORUM region, could become more competitive, and these are mainly within the realm of business, finance, insurance, royalty, licensing, and so on. As we move though towards a new regime, I think the first, as researchers and policymakers here in the room, I think our starting point should be, how has the region already benefited from the EPA, from the EPA, from all of the commitments that have been made within it. That should be our starting point, and then we should dig down into that analysis to work out the relative importance of the UK market. That analytical work needs to be done, and it's going to be quite challenging because services data is often rather limited, and we know within the region there are severe data constraints, capacity constraints as well. But that baseline data collection exercise does need to be undertaken, because it's only then that the region will know how they could benefit from a new, whatever new regime it is that the UK comes up with, and where their offensive and defensive interests lie. So that's my main recommendation, because we know that already the CARIFORUM EPA was very ambitious in terms of services. You have the mutual recognition included is viewed quite positively. It's movement of graduate trainees as well, mode 4 movement of labour, especially for graduate trainees, so that's also viewed quite favourably. There's a cultural cooperation aspect in the agreement which is quite unique. It's also viewed quite positively. Entertainment, growth of the animation sector, and so on. How will these sectors be affected by the UK's exiting out of the EU and therefore out of the CARIFORUM EPA, and what can the region do about it? I think the first exercise is to get the baseline data in hand, and that is going to be a tricky exercise, but across all of the modes this does need to be done. And I'm assuming that the UK will be more liberal, but we also have to be wary of the fact that the UK could turn more protectionist, and that includes on mode 4 and the movement of labour. And something that has arisen in my discussions is that given the weak capacity of the UK trade team, there's likely to be a pecking order in terms of FTAs, and given the relative, the UK is probably a very important market for the CARIFORUM, but the CARIFORUM is not such important market for the UK. So there is going to be this pecking order. And just one final point, it might be once the region has got the baseline data, there are some impact assessments already of the EPA, but they need to be more detailed and, more detailed in the services side. It might be that the region might opt, an alternative UK GSP regime might be more preferable, and the UK itself might design a new GSP regime that includes services. It might go a bit, it could also go further. So these options, need to be explored. But once the analytical work is done, then that can help to formulate those interests. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judy. What we'll do is we'll just take two questions. One was online, which has been asked for some time, and one on the other side, and then we'll have to wrap up this session because we're out of time. So could you read the online question, please? Then for asking the second question, if you come to this area, please. Okay, well, you ask it first. Then you go first. Since you go first. Since you're here. Yeah.
I just want to link this discussion. So my name is Arad Zaman. I'm one of the directors of one of the accredited organisations here, the Commonwealth Business Women's Network, and the Secretary General yesterday called a very important meeting, with the one-line agenda, which is to set the priorities for the Commonwealth on gender. And I think it is a really important point now. We have space that is opening up. We may not have wanted it, but we have space that is opening up to do things a little differently. And therefore, there is an absolute opportunity to prioritise and target capacity building, trade-related capacity building for women entrepreneurs, and look at innovative ways to connect up women across the Caribbean. What we're talking about here, for example, this came directly out of the discussions yesterday, looking at how we can connect up women from different parts of the Commonwealth to build and develop consortia so they can then bid for public procurement tenders. That just isn't happening now, but it's very, very possible, given, Jodie, particularly what you were saying, how service economies are opening up opportunities for women entrepreneurs. 60, 70 years, 50 years after independence, we're seeing a different landscape of women entrepreneurs. And just close with one example. 4 days ago, we announced an initiative, crowdfunding, to support women entrepreneurs in the Caribbean in the so-called missing middle. The SMEs with fast growth potential, too big to get the sort of low levels of financing, but not getting the sort of conventional financing. And this is a small campaign, $1 million, 50 entrepreneurs, 10 countries. But the point about it is you then develop these ecosystems of entrepreneurs in different Commonwealth countries. It's got to be trade mapped to find targeting those sectors that can really add value, can help to diversify those economies. But if we don't seize this opening and opportunity now to involve women as beneficiaries now in trade, it's never going to happen in this way. So when all the pieces are up in the air, this is a moment that we really need to seize, and this really came out of the discussions yesterday. And so I'm looking at one or two of the High Commissioners, Excellencies, you were there yesterday, and that is an opportunity that we really have to take forward. And I know the ESG attaches importance to that, as does many of the women across the Commonwealth that we've been in contact with. So just a feedback point.
Thanks very much. This is very helpful. And the next question is, in fact, from a woman, I think.
There's two questions.
Oh, two, please. Yes.
Okay, so this is from Debbie Ransom, and she asks, where should the buck stop in the rush for post-Brexit negotiations with the UK? Is there a need to coordinate the mix of ACP regional groupings and country negotiations over the next few years? And the next question is from James Kwaku. And he asks, given the uncertainty surrounding Brexit and the EPAs, should the EU relax its October 2016 deadline? And how should the ACP countries present that request to the EU?
Thank you. We have now actually gone over time. We still have one agenda item, which is of course the key item. What are the recommendations for moving forward?
I've got a suggestion to make that we continue the discussion informally. We could have some. We could stay in this room and chat a bit, and send in by email our recommendations. We've had the discussion now, but it's an issue of time. Paul, your suggestion?
I propose that the Ramphal Institute do some draft recommendations and then circulate to people with a deadline for comments as a practical way forward.
We're quite happy to do this, but I would also think that we would gain very much from your own individual ideas, and unfortunately, I know that there's not been as much opportunity for interventions by several persons here. Cynthia, you have a suggestion?
Yeah, I could set up a forum and you could put your suggestions through that.
An online forum.
Yeah.
So can we continue this?
Otherwise, we will all say, well, I'll do that tomorrow.
Good.
So give us a few weeks or something.
Okay, good. Okay, well, that's and one of the things that really came through, and it was a theme I think from the very outset, is that we can't sit back. I think it was David who mentioned this, and this theme. It is important for Commonwealth countries to actually take the initiative. And as Jody said in the end, the EPA countries of Africa, the Caribbean, will not be high up on the priority list. So they're the ones who have to, first of all, decide what is in their interest and how they wish to pursue those interests. So I would want to bring this to a close, but I see that Paul is insistent.
I'm ever so sorry. Things are going to move fairly quickly.
Yes.
We've got to try and get some kind of political intelligence gathering mechanism in place to monitor what's happening in that core EU-UK relationship. Because if we don't do that, then people cannot plan for different contingencies in the worst affected sectors in ACP countries. So we need to try, and a priority has to be to try and set up some mechanism to monitor what's actually happening in that core UK-EU negotiation. Because without that, people can be wasting their efforts on planning for things which are not going to happen. And we've got limited human resource capacities and financial capacities in ACP countries. So we have to identify the real critical issues per country and then provide them with political intelligence on which way the wind is blowing so they can do better contingency planning. And that's the thing that we're going to miss if we're not careful, that monitoring mechanism of what's actually happening in that core process. That's critical.
Just building upon this, if I might make a concrete proposal, that we actually do this. We have this online forum, and we pursue things. And we look at convening possibly in September, where there would be probably in a much wider group and probably more formally in conjunction with possibly with the Commonwealth Secretariat and with the ACP Secretariat, and more persons from the actual regions. Because of course the time and the other constraints, we could not have more persons coming in from outside. But possibly if we plan something like this for September, this might be a good opportunity to take stock of where we are and move forward.
Just to say a big thank you to you and the other staffers who made this possible. But 2 points quickly. One is, I think the idea of the online forum is excellent. I think that there are going to be some quite specific opportunities. There's a Commonwealth Finance Ministers meeting, I think in September, if I'm right. And then in March of early next year, there's a Commonwealth Trade Ministers meeting taking place here. These are sort of these are sort of different targets for which evidence can be put up, and I hope with your help we'll be able to do this. And then the final point I wanted to make, which was raised by two of our speakers this afternoon, was to bring together not only the governments but the private sector and also young people, given that young people have the commitment and also the risk of bad errors being made at this tricky juncture. And I think in planning ahead we need to bring in both the private enterprise, private sector element and also young people. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Liz May?
Hi, I'm Liz May from Trade Press. I just want to echo Paul's point that we, as well as understanding what's going on in the EU-UK negotiations, we really need to start understanding what negotiations, what the new International Trade Department is going to be doing, who they're going to be prioritising, what their strategy is, whether any of this could even be put to them. And I think we were at, Rosaka and I were at a meeting earlier this week where a number of quite key UK parliamentarians were there and put forward some ideas, and they were very well received, I have to say. So we shouldn't start from the footing that a lot of this is off the agenda. I think people are actually actively looking for ideas right now. So for example, that parliamentary meeting we're at, there's a trade out of poverty, APPG, they're asking for ideas at the moment. I assume the ComSec and others are going to be actively feeding into that, but there are a few opportunities coming up. And Edwin, if you do set up something maybe for September, we should be inviting EU-friendly or, you know, people that we think we would like to share some ideas, test some ideas with, to kind of gauge a bit of a reaction, I think.
Okay, thank you, Liz. Paul, finally.
Can I just take up Liz on this? Because I think there's some very specific things which can be done between now and September. And Liz seems to have a line into some of these MPs who are sympathetic. Maybe we should be looking to pulling out from these discussions 10 key points to put to those MPs and have people within this group taking a lead in liaising with other organisations around this issue, like the UK Members of Parliament. And if we could set up small little working groups from this group to actually take particular issues and move them forward. So practically, for example, David made his presentation on sugar. It would be fantastic to send that presentation to all the private sector sugar operators in the ACP that we know. Similarly on beef and veal, similarly on horticulture. In this room, we must have hundreds of email addresses of people in these individual sectors who we should be giving this information to. And if people would take a lead on liaising with particular groups, we might be able to bring them in more substantively.
Okay, all right. Fine. I suspect that all of these ideas are quite acceptable. Could I bring this session to a close, but invite you to stay on for some formal discussion and also a glass of wine before we probably go somewhere else. But thank you all so very much for this, and I wish to thank all of those who have been online. Many of you might not have been able to have asked questions, but I do hope that you will continue to be engaged with us, and we will send around some information on this online forum. We will put this on our website, and I'd also ask all of the presenters, if they would, to send us the transcripts of their presentations, because we would also like to put this on the website. So thank you very much, and do stay on forward for the drinks.